months for a payment, but this morning we have seen the distressing report that 9 children have died while waiting for their child disability payments to be processed, and our thoughts are with the families of each of these children. I know that we all want a social security system which works for those who need support and that treats them with compassion and dignity, and we have to recognise that part of that is addressing long waits and delivering these vital payments with the urgency that is required. Today's press report was heartbreaking. What assurances will the Cabinet Secretary give that this will not happen again, and what action will be taken to ensure this does not happen again?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first begin by saying if Claire Baker wishes to write to me about the constituency issue she was planning to raise, I'd be more than happy to pick that up in correspondence. Can I also say, of course, that my thoughts are also with the families of the children that are referenced in the reports in the media this morning. It is something I take exceptionally seriously, as we all do, as we deliver social security in Scotland. One important aspect, Presiding Officer, to point out is, of course, for whether it's a child or an adult with a terminal illness, these cases are dealt with exceptionally quickly. We don't publish the times for child disability payment with those with terminal illness because there's such a few number of cases, but I am looking to see what can be done to publish the information to give some reassurance to families in the most difficult of circumstances if the child is terminally ill. When we're looking at the wait times and the processing times for CDP in general, it is important, as I've said in the Chamber before, to recognise that this sometimes can take time, because unlike under the DWP system, it is Social Security Scotland that gathers the information, the supporting information about a claim, rather than that being a responsibility for the families, and that can sometimes take time to get that through. But I can give Claire Baker the reassurance that we are making strides in dealing with the processing times. The processing times are improving, and we are taking further measures to ensure that those with the longest waits are being looked at and decisions taken within the agency as soon as possible. But I will continue to keep, as I'm sure the member in the Chamber would expect, a very close eye on what is a very serious issue.
Supplementary, Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I associate my remarks with that of Claire Baker, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's comment that she will look into this and report back. But will the Cabinet Secretary also recognise it's not just the waiting time once you make an inquiry? There are quite long delays in regard to people getting through to Social Security Scotland, either on the telephone or by social media. What is being done so that people do not have to hang on a telephone for an excessive time to get an answer to the inquiry?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I do recognise that this was an issue that was causing concern, the amount of time that had been taken perhaps on the telephone waits. I don't have the figures in front of me around those wait times at the moment, but they have improved markedly since the concerns were raised, and that's thanks to the work that the agency has done to ensure that people are having their calls answered much more speedily. But I'm happy to provide the information on that and the specific numbers on that to Jeremy Balfour in writing, because I hope he can be reassured, because significant progress has been made on call wait times within the agency.
And supplementary, Willie Rennie.
These deaths, not just in child disability payment, but the adult disability payment, does it bring into sharp focus the consequences of long waits. But I do want to thank the staff at Social Security Scotland for managing to get the waits down. They're broadly in line with the DWP now, which is more welcome. But the Minister didn't really set out what practical steps she's taken to actually improve the system to make sure it doesn't happen again in future. So can she give us a bit more colour, a bit more detail as to exactly what is being done to make sure that we don't have long waits in the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I can perhaps give a flavour of it, but there are a large number of system changes that have been put in place. If I can give Mr Rennie some examples of that. We have looked at every single step in the process. So, for example, how can the application forms, which were co-designed with those who have used the DWP system, but how can those application forms be changed so we can perhaps strengthen the suggestions for clients to provide that support and information? Not to put the onus on them, but to say if they did that to begin with, that would certainly help. Additional calls immediately going in to those who do apply without supporting information, perhaps making some suggestions about the types of things, for example, a prescription list and so on, that could be sent in right at the start to allow that to be in. The greater use of in-house health and social care teams to be able to support faster decision-making, and a review of staffing levels. So those are some of the examples. They're not the only examples, Presiding Officer, but those are some of the examples. Social Security Scotland will be in Parliament soon with an invite to all MSPs to be able to talk about whether it's particular constituency cases or the work that they've been doing, and I'm sure they would absolutely welcome the opportunity to speak through that in further detail with Mr Rennie, and of course I would be happy to do so as well.
Question number 2, Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment the Ministerial Taskforce on Population has made of the potential impact of the centralisation of services on the sustainability of rural communities.
Minister Paul McLennan.
This Government established a Ministerial Taskforce on Population in 2019 to oversee the development and delivery of Scotland's first National Population Strategy in 2021. The Taskforce, which Mr Ruddock chairs, brings together ministers from across the Scottish Government, including those responsible for key public services, with a clear focus on delivering joined-up policy solutions for our communities. The Addressing Depopulation Action Plan, published in February, further highlights the action that this Government is taking to support communities, with a clear focus on the role of infrastructure and key services like education, childcare and health and social care.
Oliver Mundell.
I thank the Minister for that answer, but across Dumfriesshire, constituents of mine are finding it harder and harder to access basic services. NHS dentistry is now non-existent in many parts of the constituency. Constituents in Sanker, Kilhome and Kirkconnell tell me they can't see a GP face-to-face. Gretna Community Council say that finding the police in the community and getting them there is now near on impossible, as they've disappeared. And in Langham, people are working hard to get back basic podiatry and physiotherapy services that were taken away during COVID. Does the Minister accept that poor services make it harder for elderly, disabled and disadvantaged people to live in rural communities?
Minister.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I think there are a number of items I think that he's raised there. I think one's in terms of, obviously, NHS Dumfries. I think one of the key things in terms of that, they have increased funding this year of £12.5 million of increased investment, which takes D&G's overall funding to £364.7 million. I'm happy to take these items that he's raised, and I don't know if he's raised them with the Cabinet Secretary for Health as yet, but happy to take that as an action if he wants to write to myself or the Cabinet Secretary for Health on that particular point. I think the other points that he mentions, of course, there are 3 or 4 main points. I think when you're talking about the actions that are looked at, one of which is how do we attract people into the work. So we're talking about an attractive and wellbeing economy, which I think is really important. In my own area, housing also plays an important part as that, and I'll be undertaking a programme of visits during the summer to visit rural communities. So hopefully we'll be able to, either through himself, look at visits to Dumfries and Galway to take up some of the issues that he's raised.
Question number 3, Elena Whitham.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions the Housing Minister has had with ministerial colleagues regarding any potential impact on rural community housing of its decision not to allow the use of fossil and biofuel heating systems in new build construction.
Minister Patrick Harvey.
I regularly meet with the Minister for Housing to discuss intersecting policy portfolio interests, including the Heat in Buildings agenda. The new build heat standard, which was scrutinised by the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee and approved without opposition, is an essential part of our commitment to reach net zero, and it will have a positive impact on rural housing. This was subject to full consultation in both 2021 and 2022. With both consultations showing strong support. New build homes are required to be highly energy efficient, reducing heat demand, but bioenergy systems can be installed to provide emergency heating where required.
Elena Whitham.
I thank the Minister for that answer. As the MSP for Carrick, Cumnock and Doon Valley, where there are many rural off-grid properties relying on oil and solid fuels as their primary heating source, can I ask the Minister for clarification in relation to the new build heat standard definition regarding emergency heating, where it states in some cases and where a need can be justified, given that wood-burning stoves are at the moment the most reliable and cost-effective backstop in isolated areas, and that they can help to address the significant issue of rural fuel poverty? And can the Minister provide assurance that building standards verifiers will interpret the regulations in a way that provides certainty for house builders?
Minister.
First of all, thank Elena Whitham for that question, and I hope that she will join me in reassuring those of our constituents who currently use bioenergy systems in existing buildings that they are not affected by the changes in the new build heat standard. We recognise that heating for emergency use will sometimes be needed, even in new builds, and that may especially be the case in rural and island areas. That's why the standard permits systems for emergency use, and that could include wood-burning stoves. In most cases, we think portable solutions would be more appropriate in those circumstances to provide emergency heating, for example, during power cuts. But the regulations require that heating systems are non-polluting, and a provision for emergency use was added, which is not restricted to clean heating in response to rural concerns. But the drafting of the technical guidance on what constitutes emergency heating can be difficult to reconcile with the nature of wood-burning stoves, which are generally installed for regular, not just emergency use. We've heard the concerns raised over the past week about the use of wood-burning stoves, and we fully take those on board. And as I said yesterday, we will consider what further clarity is needed in the guidance to address those concerns, and we'll continue to work with concerned parties, developers and local authorities to ensure that any updates to the existing technical guidance address this comprehensively.
Supplementary, Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The recent Heating Buildings consultation undervalues the significance and the ability of renewable liquid fuels to contribute to a just transition and allow off-grid households to decarbonise in a fair, easy and affordable way. So can I ask the Minister if he will commit to give renewable liquid fuels a prominent role in the upcoming Heating Buildings legislation and look towards removing renewable liquid fuels such as hydro-treated vegetable oil and remove those from the polluting heating systems criteria?
Minister.
Well, I obviously don't agree with the characterisation from Mr Briggs on that. The Heating Buildings consultation, which of course goes far beyond the issue of new builds and looks at how we decarbonise our existing housing stock, that consultation specifically asks what flexibility ought to be included in relation to bioenergy systems. I look forward to hearing the responses to consultations, whether from those who lobby in favour of the industries Mr Briggs is seeking to reflect the interests of, or the wide range of other views about how we decarbonise heating, how we do it fast and how we do it fairly for all communities.
Supplementary, Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can he give more detail on what the exemptions are? I'm puzzled as to how you would vent, for instance, a portable stove. Can you also say how you would apply for them, especially with regards to woodland croft houses, crofts that are created specifically for their renewable heat potential? And how do those changes impact on solid fuel stoves used for both cooking and heating, making the best use of the resource? And will he publish the island impact assessment with these changes?
Minister.
Well, I've already set out yesterday in response to some more detailed questions on this, the information that we've published, and I have committed, and I've stated again today, that we will look to work with partners to clarify any aspects of the technical guidance that need to be clarified in order to answer some of the concerns that have been raised in the last few days. But I would reinforce that the measures that we're taking forward are about the use of fixed heating systems, primary and secondary, in new build heating, in new build housing and new build buildings. They don't apply to emergency and backup systems, many of which will be the kind of portable systems that Rhoda Grant describes.
And supplementary, Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In recent years, Shetland's seen the vulnerability of its power network. Adverse weather events of wind and snow left homes without power and heating for days. Does the Minister agree that this would be a justified need for the installation of traditional heating in new builds for backup and emergency use? And does he agree that the messaging around this policy has been confused?
Minister.
I think the Scottish Government's messaging has been very clear. I'm sorry that some people, including, I'm afraid to say, a few people in this Parliament have sought to misrepresent this as a complete ban on wood-burning stoves. It is not, it never has been, and it will not be a complete ban on wood-burning stoves. I think Beatrice Wishart is quite right that some of the communities she describes do illustrate why the provisions in relation to emergency and backup heating systems are important, and why, going forward, the Heat and Buildings Bill does need to reflect on those questions about the flexibility for biomass in relation to existing homes. I would also say, however, that Shetland is also a good example of an area of Scotland where rurality and indeed some of the issues affecting island communities are not a barrier to deploying clean heating systems, whether at an individual building level or a district heating level. Shetland, I think, is a good example of where the decarbonisation of heating can be achieved in a way that meets the needs of remote, rural and island communities.
Question number 4, Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And to ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the work undertaken by the staff and officials of Social Security Scotland to complete the move to have all payments for disabled children being paid directly by Social Security Scotland and subject to the scrutiny of the Scottish Parliament.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm incredibly proud of the work of Social Security Scotland staff and indeed those within the Scottish Government Programme and Social Security Directorate for the work that they have undertaken to achieve this key milestone. All payments for children and young people with a disability in Scotland are now paid by Social Security Scotland. By the end of 2023, over 47,000 awards were safely and securely transferred from the DWP's DLA for children to our child disability payments. £333 million was awarded to support disabled children and young people whose benefits transferred and their families.
Bill Kidd.
I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response, and can the Cabinet Secretary assure my constituents and people across Scotland that the child disability payment is designed to avoid the stress and trauma associated with the DWP benefit that it replaces?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think in response, rather than taking my word for it, I would perhaps quote from a recent STV article on this very issue around case transfer, where Rebecca spoke about the difference it has made to her. And if I can quote, Presiding Officer, there are a lot of hard things about being in a family affected by disability. This was someone taking away one of those. This has been fantastic, and I'm incredibly grateful for the values that underpin Social Security Scotland. I hope that is something which everyone can take heart in, because this was something which the Parliament passed as a bill. But I am exceptionally proud, as the Minister who has been responsible for Social Security, indeed for half of the time that it has been devolved. In saying all of that, though, as we've talked about earlier, it is very important that the Government remains open to continuous improvement, open to areas that can be worked on. And as I said in my response to Claire Baker and to Willie Rennie earlier on, that is something which, while I do take incredible pride in what has been achieved, that continuous work on improvement, it will be something which both the agency and the Government will continue.
Question number 5, Alec Riley.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what the impact of the 24-25 Scottish Budget will have on its target for reducing child poverty.
Cabinet Secretary.
Tackling child poverty is a critical mission for this Government. In the face of a deeply challenging financial situation, we continue to allocate around £3 billion a year to a range of actions to tackle poverty and mitigate the impacts of the cost crisis on households. Modelling estimates that this Government's policies, including the Scottish Child Payment, will keep 100,000 children out of relative poverty in 24-25. We remain absolutely committed to meeting our statutory child poverty targets, and will continue to do everything within the scope of our powers and our budget to deliver the change needed.
Alec Riley.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan states, and I quote, "Homelessness has a devastating impact on families and children, increasing barriers to accessing employment and education, disrupting social support networks and negatively affecting mental health and physical health." So my question to the Cabinet Secretary is, what discussions did the Cabinet Secretary have, if any, with the Finance Secretary in the lead-up to the budget on the impact on child poverty of the cut of £200 million in the Affordable Housing Supply Programme?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as the member would expect, I of course had discussions with the Finance Secretary and other Cabinet colleagues about the difficult decisions that this government had to make when we were looking at the budget. But I would say very gently to Mr Rowley, I said in a recent press article, and it was something that I meant, that I do believe that tackling poverty is something that we could work with an incoming UK Labour government on, if they indeed are successful at the next election. It takes two to have that productive relationship, however, and it also takes two governments to take action. This government is continuing to take action and will continue to take action to support those that are being harmed by Westminster. But it does take the both governments, and the best thing, I think, that Mr Rowley and I could do together, I hope, is to actually ensure that any incoming Labour government reversed the cuts to revenue and capital for the Scottish Government, and then we wouldn't be in the place of taking the difficult decisions that we had to take as a government.
Question number 6, Stephanie Callaghan.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the Child Poverty Action Group's recent analysis of official data, showing that 4.3 million children were in relative poverty across the UK, up from 3.6 million in 2010-11.
Cabinet Secretary.
This analysis demonstrates the devastating impact of the UK Government's decade of austerity and welfare cuts on families across the UK. And while the Scottish Government policies are estimated to keep 100,000 children out of relative poverty in 24-25, we could go so much further if UK Government policies were not actively working against us. I have repeatedly called for the UK Government to reform universal credit, including by introducing an essentials guarantee and abolishing the two-child limit, which could lift 40,000 children out of poverty in Scotland. The spring budget was another failed opportunity to make the change that is needed.
Stephanie Callaghan.
I agree that child poverty does remain unacceptably high, particularly amongst disabled children whose families are disproportionately impacted by the cost of living crisis. Yet Scotland has reduced child poverty, helped with social security measures like the child disability payment. So can I ask what steps are the Scottish Government taking to increase the uptake of the child disability payment in my Uddingston and Bellshill constituency and across Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, this year alone we are investing £1.1 billion more than the UK Government gives us for social security, and we are taking that very seriously as an investment in the people of Scotland. We also take very seriously our obligations to ensure that those that are eligible for payments are both encouraged and supported to apply for what they are entitled to. So we already have received 6,000 child disability payment applications in North and South Lanarkshire, with take-up being driven by one example of this through our local delivery team, something which again is unique to the Scottish system. We will continue to ensure that we encourage those that are eligible to apply, to give them that support, and I hope one of the quotes I used earlier, Presiding Officer, gives the type of encouragement to people to come forward and be encouraged that there is a system without stigma, but instead with support for them.
And brief supplementary, Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I note what the Cabinet Secretary said in her answer and in previous answers about an incoming Labour Government, and she will want to, I'm sure, support the transformational policies like the New Deal for Working People that will put money in people's pockets. But does she recognise in her own responsibilities here in Scotland that prior to recess, the annual release of official statistics showed that child poverty levels have been static at 24%, significantly above the interim target of 18%, which the Scottish Government is now almost certain to miss? Does she accept that she is going to miss these legally set targets? And if so, when is she going to come to this chamber and outline her concerns around that?
Well, I don't accept the premise of that argument, Presiding Officer. As I said in my original remarks to Stephanie Callaghan, we are absolutely determined to meet our anti-poverty targets. You know what would make it a lot easier, though, Presiding Officer, as I have said and will continue to say in this chamber? If there wasn't one government trying to lift people out of poverty and another government, whichever, whether it's Labour or Tory, pushing them into poverty, that would help the people a hell of a lot more.
And I would like to squeeze in questions 7 and 8, but I will need cooperation. I need short, succinct questions and short, succinct answers. With that, question number 7, Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what work it is undertaking to give greater representation to older people.
Minister Paul McLennan.
We continue to work with our trusted partners in the Older People's Strategic Action Forum on a range of priorities for advancing age equality. Ms Ruddock chaired the last meeting on the 27th of February. A Fairer Scotland for Older People framework for action was developed to challenge the inequalities older people face as they age. The framework outlines a range of activities we're undertaking to support older people to improve their lives, tackle age inequality and to celebrate older people in Scotland. Through our Equalities and Human Rights Fund, we are investing over £2.2 million in support of older people's organisations and age equality projects that deliver positive outcomes for older people.
Colin Smith.
Thank you, President Officer. A recent survey by Independent Age showed that almost 3/4 of those over 65 in Scotland think the issues they face are badly understood. Age Scotland's recent big survey revealed that just 3% of respondents felt it was easy for older people to have their voices heard by decision makers. Given that, both surveys showed overwhelming support for an older person's Commissioner for Scotland. Why does the Minister think those older people are wrong? Why does he think the work he's described is not in the view of older people working for them?
Minister.
Pleasure of meeting Independent Age a number of months ago and talked to them about some of these issues and again impacting the housing. In particular, I mentioned it in about the Equality and Human Rights Fund. And over £2.2 million of that fund does go towards providing support for national organisations. Now that obviously contributes as well to the Age Scotland National Helpline. Now through that work, they identified £1.5 million for unclaimed benefits for older people who called their helpline then. So we're continuing also investing £3.8 million in funding to support another 53 organisations. And the point he mentions in regards to the Older People Commissioner, obviously I'm aware of the work that he's doing on that point. Obviously we'll consider the evidence that's gathered by the consultation and respond to its findings on that. Our main priority is to support older people facing hardship through this cost of living crisis.
Question number 8, Liam Kerr.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to figures showing there has been a decrease in the number of new homes started in 2023 compared with 2022.
Minister Paul McLennan.
The Scottish Government has led the UK in housing, delivering more than 128,000 affordable homes since 2007, over 90,000 of which were for social rent. In 22-23 there was a disappointing decrease in starts, which was reflected right across the UK. The impact of inflation, supply chain issues and labour shortages linked to Brexit combined to create an extremely challenging environment. We remain committed to close partnership working to mitigate these challenges. In the same year, Scotland's completion rates for new builds increased to 43 homes per 10,000 people. England's rate was 38 per 10,000 and Wales was 18 homes per 10,000.
Liam Kerr.
Reported figures show that new builds in Aberdeen fell from 1,182 in 2022 to 553 in 2023. The Council says that due to work needed to address RAC in Balnagask, other housing projects will be delayed. So will the Scottish Government reverse its opposition to helping Aberdeen Council to address RAC so these other housing projects can go ahead?
Minister.
Just on that point, I've met with Aberdeen Council since the RAC was discussed. I met with them prior to that as well, and we've had numerous meetings before that. As you'll be aware, they're obviously having an options appraisal at the moment, and we'll continue to discuss and develop with them. We've also been very flexible in terms of funding they received for Ukraine housing, and worked with them in terms of that to look at the units that's required. So it does actually answer the question.
Members, just let the Minister respond.
So as I said, we continue to work with Aberdeen on that particular point in terms of the new build. We also, I think it was really important, we've also set up a Housing Investment Taskforce, which looks trying to get more funding into the system, which would include more funding for Aberdeen. But happy to discuss the issue further with the member.
And a very brief supplementary, Mr Mason.
Thank you. The Minister mentioned the Housing Investment Taskforce in his last answer. Can he tell us any more about it?
Minister.
The medium-term outlook, obviously, for capital remains challenging, with an expected 8.7% real terms cut to our capital funding between 23-24 and 27-28. Given that, I was delighted to convene and chair the first meeting of the Housing Investment Taskforce earlier this month, just 2 weeks ago. Over the next coming months, members will address longer-term investment barriers and help attract additional private sector funding for all tenures of housing in Scotland.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes portfolio questions, and there will be a very short pause before we move on to the next line of business to allow frontbench teams to change position should they so wish. Thank you.
The next item of business is a statement by Mary McCallan on Climate Change Committee Scotland report, Next Steps. Before we move to that item of business, I want to make the following remarks. Important aspects of this afternoon's statement have been reported in various media outlets. Where the Government chooses to share information pertaining to any ministerial statement in advance of that statement being made, the Government remains responsible for ensuring that such information is not reported by the media before the Parliament learns of it. I have spoken to the Minister for Parliamentary Business and I've asked that the Cabinet Secretary apologises to the Chamber for this breach of our long-established good practice guidance on announcements. The Chamber will be aware that I have previously disallowed or truncated statements. However, the information reported in the press today is key to actions that may impact on legislation in this Parliament and the way the Government is held accountable by the Parliament. Additionally, there is information in the statement that hasn't been previously reported, and for those reasons, as I do not wish to disadvantage other members, I intend to allow the statement to be made, but I would remind the Government in the strongest terms possible that this Parliament must be given its proper place. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and there will be no interruptions or interventions during her statement, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, please allow me to begin by setting out my regret and indeed my apology to you and to the Chamber for the media speculation that has surrounded the content of my statement today. I regret it because I take the integrity of the Parliament very seriously and your role within that, but equally because it's made it more difficult for me to communicate something which I think requires very careful, nuanced and detailed communication. I've asked the Permanent Secretary, as a matter of urgency, to conduct an internal investigation into the circumstances. Presiding Officer, the race to net zero is one that we must all win, and I want to begin by affirming this Government's unwavering commitment to ending our contribution to global emissions by 2045 at the latest, as agreed by Parliament on a cross-party basis. I was grateful for the latest report from the Committee on Climate Change on our progress in reducing emissions. The CCC are a key partner in our net zero journey and their insights are essential. Their report recognised much to be proud of, including this Government's provision of free bus travel to all under 22s, our work delivering more woodland in Scotland in a year than any other UK nations combined, and our work in decarbonising heat and buildings, noting that it could become a template for the rest of the UK. Considerable progress is also being made in energy. Scotland is becoming a renewables powerhouse, with 87.9% of electricity generation coming from zero or low carbon sources in 2022. These are just some of the examples of the considerable work that has been taken and which sees us nearly halfway to net zero, narrowly missing our most recent annual emission reduction target, but still decarbonising faster than the UK average. But quite rightly, just as with the UK Government, the CCC challenges us to go further. And that's exactly what we will do, as today I'm announcing a new package of climate action measures, which we will deliver with partners to support Scotland's transition to net zero. Firstly, Presiding Officer, the global transition to zero emissions vehicles is happening apace. Indeed, major car manufacturers have named the day when they will cease manufacture of new petrol and diesel vehicles. Scotland has long been at the forefront of helping people make the transition to EVs, but now we will go further, working in partnership to more than quadruple the number of electric vehicle charge points across Scotland. Collaborating across the public and private sector, Scotland will see approximately 24,000 additional charge points by 2030. This will help ease any remaining range anxiety that people may feel and make sure that going electric is an option for every part of our nation. To make public transport fit better with people's lives and to encourage us all to choose more sustainable transport, we will also explore a new national integrated ticketing system for public transport in Scotland. We will encourage and support operators across all modes of transport to participate in this project, which aims to enable passengers to use one ticketing system for all elements of a journey. We will help people be less reliant on cars, and we will publish a route map to help deliver a 20% reduction in car use. This will not be a one-size-fits-all, top-down approach. We understand that urban and rural Scotland will contribute differently to this, and our Just Transition Plan for transport will ensure support for all communities. Turning to other vehicles, we will support the transition away from petrol and diesel vans. Working with business, including the largest companies for an initial phase, and in line with our New Deal for Business principles, we will develop plans and support mechanisms to accelerate the switch to zero-emission technologies and more sustainable modes. We understand the importance of this transition to small businesses and independent traders in particular, and we'll ensure that their needs are at the heart of this work. Scotland's Food and Drink Presiding Officer is a significant national success story, and food security is important to this government. That's why we are supporting our farming community to continue producing food whilst lowering emissions. The Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs is working with the sector to deliver this, including through the ongoing Agricultural and Rural Communities Bill and the Agriculture Reform Board that she co-chairs with the National Farmers Union of Scotland. But we want to do more to support our agricultural sector to lead the way in regenerative farming and food production. That's why we will take forward a pilot scheme with some Scottish farms to establish future appropriate uptake of methane-suppressing feed products or additives, a key measure to reduce emissions from livestock where practical. Some of these additives are being pioneered here in Scotland, so we look forward to working on this homegrown innovation. Proportionate carbon audits will also be required by farms receiving public support by 2028 at the latest. Nutrient management plans will build on this and be integrated into the whole farm plans. We will also accelerate our regional land use partnerships, with up to 3 new areas coming into the initiative over the next year, recognising, of course, that successful partnerships are those driven by communities. And to further accelerate peatland restoration, we will investigate how partial rewetting can coexist with continued agricultural activity and access to agricultural support, including investing up to £1 million in pilot projects. This summer, Presiding Officer, we will also launch a consultation on carbon land tax on the largest estates, as part of considering regulatory and fiscal measures that could further incentivise peatland restoration, afforestation and renewable energy production. We're also considering the recommendations from the Green Heat Finance Taskforce to review and publish by the end of the year analysis of how non-domestic rates relief can better support our climate ambitions and encourage investment in energy efficiency and clean heating systems. This will be developed working closely with the business community in line with New Deal for Business principles. Presiding Officer, Scotland is distinguished by the importance that we place on a just transition. We will publish our final energy strategy and just transition plan this summer, to be followed by draft plans for agriculture, transport, buildings and construction. Moreover, following the publication of a Just Transition Plan for Grangemouth, I can confirm today that we will co-develop a Just Transition Plan for Musmoran. These policies again emphasise the critical role that Scottish businesses and industry play in our net zero transformation, and we will work closely with them throughout delivery. Reflecting on the recent Audit Scotland report on climate change governance, we will redouble efforts to ensure that net zero is fully considered in our workforce, spending, policy development and structures, starting with the full rollout of a net zero assessment in the Scottish Government from the end of 2024. And to ensure that spending across the public sector reflects our net zero ambitions, we will work with COSLA, including through our climate delivery framework, to understand wider public sector spend and opportunities for action. Finally, we will propose the establishment of a 4 nations climate response group, with a remit including climate financing and the balance of reserved and devolved powers. These policies, they sit alongside extensive ongoing work and will be built on through our next climate change plan and our green industrial strategy. Presiding Officer, with this ambitious new package, allow there to be no doubt about the seriousness with which this government treats the climate and nature crises and our readiness to act, to deliver. We must, however, acknowledge that we do so in difficult circumstances. The Climate Change Committee is clear, and I quote, that the UK is already substantially off track for 2030 and achieving future UK carbon budgets will, I quote, require sustained increase in the pace and breadth of decarbonisation across most major sectors. Indeed, we do see climate backtracking at UK level. With severe budgetary restrictions imposed by the UK Government and under the continuing constraints of devolution, we are trying to achieve societal and economic transformation with one hand tied behind our back. Indeed, such is the UK's unprecedented economic mismanagement that full delivery of our plans will be contingent on the UK Government reversing the 9% cut to our capital budget. This Government and Parliament, we rightly have high ambitions. And it's beyond doubt that investing now in net zero is the right thing for our environment, our society and our economy. But we are being held back. So I am asking MSPs from across the chamber to work with us to call on the UK Government to reverse Scotland's capital cut. And whilst the opposition quite rightly demand that the Scottish Government take urgent action to address the climate crisis, if they are serious about this challenge, they must now stand with us in support of today's policy package and the remainder of the work that we're taking forward across this year and the coming years, and do that instead of opposing the measures that we propose. In this challenging context of cuts, UK backtracking, we accept the CCC's recent re-articulation that this Parliament's interim 2030 target is out of reach. We must now act to chart a course to 2045 at a pace and a scale that is feasible, fair and just. And with this in mind, I can today confirm that working with Parliament on a timetable, the Scottish Government will bring forward expedited legislation to address matters raised by the CCC and ensure our legislative framework better reflects the reality of long-term climate policy making. The narrowly drawn bill will retain our legal commitment to 2045 alongside annual reporting on progress, whilst introducing a target approach based on 5 yearly carbon budgets. Presiding Officer, with our legal commitment to reach net zero by 2045 steadfastly remaining and recommitted today, and with Scotland's emissions already nearly cut in half, we are well positioned to continue leading on climate action that's fair and ambitious and capable of rising to the emergency before us. This Government will not yield to climate culture wars. We will never shirk our duty to those impacted by climate change today and to future generations. Together, we know we can tackle the crisis with the pace and urgency that's required. Indeed, with very minor legislative amendments that I'm proposing today, we will pave the way for continued ambition and pragmatic delivery against this most important challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which time we will move on to the next item of business. I would ask those members who would wish to seek to ask a question to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Douglas Lumsden.
Presiding Officer, I would first like to thank the BBC for advance sight of the Cabinet Secretary's statement. It's a shame that this Government is continuing to show such contempt for this Parliament. And when we saw the news last night that the Scottish Government were scrapping their climate targets, we all knew what was going to be in the Cabinet Secretary's statement. A lot of smoke and mirrors, rehashing announcements and blaming everyone else they can for their own failure. But let us be crystal clear, the key areas of emissions are devolved. Transport, housing, agriculture, all devolved, and this announcement is an absolute humiliation for the SNP. But even more humiliating for the Greens, who have ditched environmentalism for nationalism. In December last year, the Cabinet Secretary told this Parliament that world leaders were approaching the Scottish Government for advice on tackling climate change, but we never did find out who was calling, and I bet her phone is silent now. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary for the timetable for bringing forward legislation, when we will see the climate change plan, and can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the new annual reporting on progress will have no legally committed targets?
Cabinet Secretary, please resume seat. Can I just say that the tone of this whole statement is not proceeding like that. We've got business to get through, important business. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, thank you. There is more than a hint of hypocrisy in Douglas Lumsden's contribution today. Look, the truth of the matter is that the Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament, they voted for these climate targets, and principally the 2030 75% target, but they have stood in the way of even modest measures that we have sought to bring forward in order to realise them. They have opposed low emission zones in city centres, a prime intervention to improve air quality. They worked relentlessly to cease the progress on the deposit return scheme, and they now oppose heating standards and our efforts to tackle some of the most problematic emissions in Scotland. Meanwhile, their colleagues in the UK Government are fighting to open coal mining in England. They are failing to deploy on and offshore wind and inexplicably refusing to progress CCUS in Scotland. So, as I say, more than a hint of hypocrisy. As regards the very short question that was at the end of Douglas Lumsden's narration on the timetable of the bill, I will work hard with the Parliament to have a timetable put in place. It will be expedited, and when that legislation is brought forward, it will speak to both the climate change plan and the annual reporting of targets.
Thank you. I would just advise that Mr Lumsden did have 1 minute and 30 seconds to pose his issues, raise his issues. I call Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I note both the comments you have made and the Presiding Officer about this statement. Thursday, the 18th of April 2024 will go down as the day that Scotland officially went from being a world leader in climate targets to a world leader in scrapping targets. So, ambitious targets were not backed up by ambitious action. The Committee on Climate Change identified 19 policy areas where this SNP Green Government has either no plan, an insufficient plan, or needs to take action to meet the net zero by 2045 target. So, can the Cabinet Secretary clarify whether any interim targets and legal reporting will be ditched in the bill she mentioned? She made a series of announcements about upcoming work, but can we get the timescale and the publication dates for all these delayed strategies? The climate change plan, the green industrial strategy, the energy strategy and just transition plan, the draft set of plans for agriculture, construction and transport. We are still waiting publication dates. And can the Cabinet Secretary clarify what action the Scottish Government will now take to deliver affordable rail services, support local authorities so we have the bus services people can use, not hundreds more cut, so that constituents can actually have low-carbon, affordable public transport choices they can make? Presiding Officer, when I first launched the climate statement in Parliament in the early days, I reflected on the worst flooding in living memory in southern African states. We are now seeing regular extreme flooding in Scotland. So will the Cabinet Secretary commit to annual reporting on climate change so we do not lose the momentum and the proper parliamentary scrutiny that we need to work together to tackle this climate crisis?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as regards annual reporting, I would just point Sarah Boyack to the section in my statement where I did confirm that that would be retained as part of the wider move to carbon budgeting. And as I say, I will bring forward more detail on the legislation when it's introduced to Parliament. I would ask Sarah Boyack not to... Look, I understand disappointment. I'm disappointed myself. My team and I have worked exceptionally hard not to have to make the change that we're making today. But let's not overplay what is being done here. This is a minor legislative amendment, restating our 2045 goal, but recasting the trajectory in line with what our independent advisers in the Committee on Climate Change advise is achievable. Sarah Boyack, others, every party across the chamber, they understood when we passed the previous climate legislation, the CCC's view that the 75% target was likely to be beyond what was achievable. And in fact, it is my and the government's efforts now to correct that with a narrow bill, which will pave the way, we hope, for the continued delivery and action that we have sought to demonstrate in previous years.
I call Ben Macpherson to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Presiding Officer, in an answer to a Freedom of Information request published in autumn last year, it has been stated by the Scottish Government that Scotland's carbon dioxide emissions represent around only 0.1% of global emissions, according to recent statistics. Therefore, in playing our active part to tackle the climate emergency, we must have perspective and be honest about the fact that any Scottish actions to try to prevent climate change can only ever be a very small but worthwhile part of a much bigger global challenge. In that context, does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that it is important to acknowledge that Scotland is already going further and faster than many other comparable countries in our efforts to reduce emissions and innovate, and that today's statement confirms we will purposefully continue to do so with ambition and credibility? And does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that we must collectively appreciate the economic social and health benefits of taking actions to reduce emissions, that they are at least as important as any positive environmental impacts that such measures towards net zero may have.
Cabinet Secretary. Presiding Officer, on the first part of Ben McPherson's question, which I don't disagree with at all, I would say that look, Scotland alone cannot solve the world's problems when it comes to climate change, but the world's problems will not be solved without countries like Scotland playing their fullest part, and that's exactly what this government intends to do. In 2019, the Parliament agreed right across cross-party lines to a highly ambitious set of targets. As I've said, we were advised at the time that there was not a clear path, as far as the CCC could see it, to achieving them. Now, I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing. I think it has driven ambition and action in the period since. But we have also learned many lessons from them, including on harsh winters that affect annual targets that don't necessarily reflect how emissions reduction actually occurs over a long period of time. But I do absolutely agree with Ben McPherson that our journey to net zero, it must be delivered in a way that's fair, it must be just, it must be along a pathway that aligns with expert guidance and advice. And that's why today I am announcing this package of measures which sits alongside the bold plans that we already had for this year. And it's why I'm making this narrow amendment to the climate legislation as it stands, so that we can continue to pursue that progress.
I call Graham Simpson to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you very much. But, Presiding Officer, this is an admission of failure. And I am absolutely astonished that the two Green ministers have not resigned in disgust. But there they are, sat there on the front bench. Now, the Cabinet Secretary described, she says, I can't even hear myself talk.
Mr Simpson, please reduce your seat. Mr Swinney, please refrain from doing that. We need to make progress, have the questions, hear the responses. Mr Simpson, please resume.
So it was Mr Swinney, a lot of hot air there from Mr Swinney.
Mr Simpson, please just resume your question.
The Cabinet Secretary talks about a minor legislative amendment, but targets were set in this Act, the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Targets Act 2019. The requirement to have a climate change plan, which is now overdue, was also in that Act. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell us what will remain in this Act in her, what she describes as a minor legislative amendment?
Cabinet Secretary. Presiding Officer, it's the intention of the Government that the vast majority of what is in the Act will be retained, subject to those changes that I have set out today, which coalesce principally around the 2030 target and annual targets. But as I've said, I intend to seek to take the bill forward on an expedited basis. I'll work with the Parliament on that timetable and indeed on the content of the bill.
I call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The plans and ambitions of the Government require sufficient resource to be realised. Our climate targets and how we go about realising them cannot be discussed or considered in isolation from the wider UK context. What will the Cabinet Secretary do to reiterate to the UK Government that it must reverse the swingeing cuts it has imposed on Scotland in order for us to fully realise our ambitions for climate and nature?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there's absolutely no doubt that the limits of devolution, as well as other matters, including technological advance, etc., are a hindrance on what we are seeking to do, which is to institute the economic and the societal transformation that the climate emergency demands on us. As I said in my statement, the budgetary restrictions imposed by the UK Government, and in particular that up to 9% cut to our capital budget, are devastating for our ambitions on climate change. MSPs across this chamber, I am calling on them to join with us and to call upon the UK Government to reverse Scotland's capital cut so that we can invest in the kinds of infrastructure which countries across the world are. And I would point to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, similar schemes that the EU are taking forward, and I would highlight the absolute absence of those plans at UK level from the current incumbent government and equally from the Labour Party, who are seeking to enter number 10, having just ditched their green investment pledge of £28 billion.
I call Colin Smith to be followed by John Swinney.
Does the Cabinet Secretary understand that she can add yet more plans, yet more strategies to the 82 that we've had already? But it's the actions of this government that has led to this humiliating, not minor, ditching of targets. Take woodland creation. The Climate Change Committee said it needs to double. But this month, this government are halving the budget. So does the Cabinet Secretary believe that action will increase or decrease woodland creation? Will this be just yet another missed target?
Cabinet Secretary.
As Colin Smith, talks about plans and strategies and action, that's what delivery is made from. It doesn't come from what Colin Smith does and what his party do, which is turn up to this chamber and vote for targets and then fail to back even modest measures that the government brings forward to try and institute them. This government has, in recent years, delivered some extremely ambitious policies. He mentions forestry. 75% of all new forests created in the UK in recent years have been in Scotland. We are investing £250 million in peatland restoration, 65 million in nature restoration. We've got 37% of our waters in marine protected areas, and my colleagues are taking forward a biodiversity strategy now. It is very easy to be Colin Smith. It is much more difficult.
Cabinet Secretary, please resume. We need to have the courtesy and respect to listen to the Cabinet Secretary's response. Please so proceed. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I was going to go on to say it is much more difficult to be those who are responsible for delivery, but that's exactly what this government is committed to.
I call John Swinney to be followed by Alec Cole-Hamilton.
Presiding Officer, given the degree to which many of the practical changes that are required to achieve our climate targets are often contested or the subject of criticism and frequently resisted by some members of Parliament, what significance does the Cabinet Secretary attach to trying to overcome these obstacles by working with local community-driven initiatives such as the one she visited in my constituency yesterday, where people are coming together in Dunkeld and Burnham to encourage real commitment around climate action within their own community? Does that not offer us more hope than the hot air and empty rhetoric we've heard from the opposition today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, it absolutely does. I know from, and I know my colleagues will be the same, from the engagement that we have with people who care about this issue across the country, you can often feel that the magnitude of the climate crisis makes you feel that as an individual you can't contribute, you can't make a difference. But it's not the case. And examples like the Climate Cafe initiative, including where it was born in Dunkeld and Burnham that I visited yesterday, they exemplify how communities and action that is driven from the ground up is happening all across Scotland, and it is making a considerable difference in this all of Scotland, all of government, all of business, all of society challenge.
I call Alec Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, what the Cabinet Secretary describes as a minor legislative amendment is in fact a monstrous generational betrayal from the SNP and their Green partners. It is a cynical attempt to dodge bad press by simply abolishing the climate change targets that they have repeatedly missed. For years, we have had to endure smug lectures from nationalist ministers about how Scotland was a world leader on climate targets, but it is never delivered on the hard graft of insulating homes, making transport cleaner or creating green jobs. They are incapable of getting even the basics right because their nationalism has always trumped their environmentalism. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, given the botched recycling schemes, the rail fare hikes, the bus service cuts, is there anywhere else on the planet where Greens in government have torched climate targets for a seat at the table?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Alex Cole-Hamilton's faux outrage in the Chamber today is utterly true to form. He deserves an Oscar for his contribution. A number of weeks ago, he sat with me and with colleagues in Butte House at our invitation, and he listened to the Committee on Climate Change give us a very factual lecture and update on the state of play as regards climate. And two key points were made. 75% by 2030 was always regarded as pushing at the limits of what was possible, and that annual targets and the measuring thereof don't necessarily reflect how long-term emissions actually happens. He knows this, and yet he plays up in the Chamber today. What I would say to him is that the climate crisis, the twin crises of nature loss, these are too important for people like Alex Cole-Hamilton to politicise them. Scotland remains a world leader when it comes to climate change. Our 2045 target is absolutely steadfast, and we are already nearly halfway to net zero, with a significant number of plans in place to continue that journey.
I would advise members that we need more succinct questions and answers. Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Elena Whitham.
Decades of inaction have brought us to this point. Today must be a pivotal moment in our fight against the climate emergency for a livable future. We may have come halfway, but that's the easy part. Decarbonising our homes, transitioning to regenerative zero-carbon farming, addressing transport emissions, transforming our economy, these are the challenges ahead. While the Scottish Government is making progress, we must go further and move faster. Today's package of measures to accelerate action will help make this happen. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that blocking climate action for opposition's sake or because of vested interests is not good enough, and that Labour and the Tories must stop their hypocrisy and get behind this climate acceleration package?
Officer, I absolutely agree with Maggie Chapman. As I said at the beginning of my statement, the race to net zero is one that we must all win, and we frankly will not get there with some of the hypocrisy that's being demonstrated today. I've already said you will never hear me say, as the Net Zero Secretary, that Scotland is yet doing enough. Frankly, I don't think any country in the world will be able to say that until we have reached net zero. That's why we need communities across Scotland, business and industry, the third sector, our local authorities and MSPs across this chamber to unite and to put in the hard yards when it comes to supporting actions to deliver emissions reduction. So I absolutely agree. It's time for the opposition to stop the hypocrisy, unite across the chamber, get behind today's policy package and don't stand in the way of the measures that we seek to bring forward for emissions reduction in Scotland.
I call Elena Whitham to be followed by Maurice Golden.
Deputy Presiding Officer, regrettably the cross-party consensus that did exist in 2019, both here and in Westminster, has evaporated. We thought that the UK Government was going to act in lockstep with us on emissions, but it failed to do so, and it has even rolled back on key policies. Cabinet Secretary, does this not show the limits of devolution? And given the existential threat we are facing, how can she support all of us collectively in this place to push for the changes we need to see right across all of these islands and indeed globally?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Elena Whitham is absolutely right. I hope that we can reconvene that cross-party consensus that has existed in the past but has been eroded in recent times. She's also absolutely right. It does nobody any favours to underplay the scale of what's required to tackle climate change. I've talked about that transformation, and as a devolved government, trying to do that when you don't have powers over oil and gas licensing, over CCUS, over the long overdue grid upgrades that we require right across the country, over the ability to change vehicle excise duty and other interventions that encourage different behaviours in transport. I will seek to address this by that commitment I made in the statement for a Four Nations climate response. I will be seeking cooperation across the UK, and I will be trying to encourage colleagues at UK government level of whatever colour to join us in that.
I call Maurice Golden, followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Having abandoned the 2030 net zero target, the SNP Greens need to prove this isn't the beginning of a general retreat on climate policy. No more warm words or blaming non-decision makers for decisions the Scottish Government have made. Sustainable consumption and behaviour change will be key to meeting our net zero targets, yet neither receive a mention in the statement. What transformational action is being taken in these two important areas?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'm afraid I didn't actually catch the last part of Maurice Golden's statement, if you would be able to repeat it.
Mr Golden, could you please repeat towards the end of the question you've put on the record?
Sustainable consumption and behaviour change will be key to meeting our net zero targets, yet neither receive a mention in the statement. What transformational action has been taken in these two important areas?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, thank you, and I apologise to Maurice Golden for not catching that. This statement today and the additional policies that were announced are not intended to be an exhaustive list. They sit atop everything else that this government is taking forward this year and in coming years. And to answer Maurice Golden's question, I would point him just to one example in the Circular Economy Bill and the Waste Route Map that my colleague Lorna Slater is currently taking through Parliament. I really urge Maurice Golden and his colleagues to think very carefully about the hypocrisy that they are demonstrating today. They know the actions or the inactions, frankly, that their colleagues in Westminster have taken. They must also know how frequently they have stood up in this chamber and opposed measures that this government has sought to take forward. I challenge them today to put that to bed and to join us in action.
And I call Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, to secure the step change in all our behaviours required to tackle climate change, including political behaviour in this place, quite frankly, we need to be clear about the impact of climate change, not just the impact overseas, but also here at home. Can I therefore ask the Cabinet Secretary how the Scottish Government seeks to highlight the consequences of climate change on Scotland to our communities across Scotland, such as the recently reported concerns over food shortages and rising food prices in the UK as a consequence of severe weather events?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I think Bob Doris's observations are absolutely right. In many ways in Scotland we are not on the front line of climate change, and we require to remind people in Scotland about our moral obligation to support communities throughout the world who are right now on the front line of climate change. But equally, we have seen in recent months in Scotland the very real impacts of continued adverse weather patterns on our communities, not least the record number of named storms that Scotland suffered this winter, with impacts on our transport infrastructure and indeed with lives lost. So the combination of both of those things, I think, are very important as part of the message as to why we must continue to make action.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the statement. I apologise to those additional members who sought to ask a question that I was not able to squeeze them in. That was as a result of the fact that some of the questions and answers were excessively long, and I also need to protect the rest of the afternoon's business. Thank you. There will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business to allow front bench teams to change position. Thank you.
Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 12882 in the name of Mark Griffin on Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council Bill at Stage 1. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And I call on Mark Griffin to speak to and move the motion around 8 minutes. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And just at the outset, make a voluntary declaration of interest as a member of USDA and Unite Unions. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to move the motion in my name and ask that Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council Bill. Now, before I properly begin, I would like to thank the staff in the Non-Government Bill Unit who have worked closely with me to introduce this bill to Parliament alongside members of my own staff, past and present. This bill will establish an independent advisory council with permanent trade union and worker representatives. It will scrutinise the legislative proposals and framework for employment injury benefit in Scotland. The bill gives the council the power to investigate and review emerging industrial and employment hazards that result in disablement through disease or injury. And that includes the power to conduct research independently and make recommendations for the ongoing evolution of the devolved employment injuries assistance framework. The Council's investigations may lead to the expansion of benefit eligibility to further groups of people who are injured or ill because of where they work. And appeal to every member in this chamber not to turn their backs on the workers who find themselves grappling with injury and disease brought on as a result of their job. Nurses, social care workers, teachers, footballers and shop workers who have become ill directly because of the work they do, they deserve our support. Sheena, a teacher in Dundee who now suffers from long COVID after likely catching the virus in the classroom she was teaching in. She told me about her invisible disease, which has left her hard of hearing and continually fatigued, unable to return to the job she loves. Sam, who, suffering from an asbestos-related condition, has highlighted the plight of women workers who have been exposed to chemicals, dyes and dust, yet a gendered system effectively prevents their entitlement to the benefits they clearly need. If you were a man, and yep, certainly.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, I think there's a lot of agreement with what he says, that we should absolutely be dealing with some of these issues. But am I right in saying that his bill does not include any money, any costing, to pay the teachers, the other people who do deserve such benefits?
Mark Griffin.
No, this establishes a council that establishes the workers who are impacted by these illnesses and injuries, that gets them round the table to designing the benefit. The budget to pay for these conditions has been devolved from the UK Parliament to this Parliament. It's up to this Parliament to take the responsibility of creating a system that is fit for purpose, that doesn't ignore the female workers that have been ignored for the last 40 to 50 years. And the female workers, if you had a man who works with asbestos and contracts mesothelioma as a result of their exposure, they're covered. But if you're a woman who works in an environment with asbestos, because you just happen to not touch the asbestos through the course of your work, but still inhaled the fumes every day, you're completely ignored by this system. And it's people like that that we need round the table to design this benefit as it's introduced, as it's devolved, and it's a huge gap in the devolution process so far. So I really need to express my sincere thanks to Sheena, to Sam and the countless others who have shared their absolutely heartbreaking stories with me over the years. They've absolutely convinced me of the need, the necessity for this bill. Organisations like the Disabled Workers Committee of the STUC, Action on Asbestos, Thomson Solicitors, Scottish Hazards, Long COVID Scotland, Child Poverty Action Group, Close the Gap, Scottish Healthcare Workers Coalition and even the Government's own established Fair Work Convention have all shaped and supported the development of this bill. I'm grateful for the endorsement of trade unions, including Unite, USDA, GMB, Unison, PFA Scotland, the Fire Brigade Union. All members of the STUC back this proposal. The SNP trade union group back this proposal. It's just a shame the Government don't listen to their own trade union members. Yesterday, the STUC unanimously adopted a motion of support for this bill, calling for the Government to accelerate the delivery of Scottish employment injury assistance and an advisory council. I'd also like to mention the many ex-professional footballers who have supported my colleague Michael Mara's injury time campaign to have brain injuries in football classified as an industrial injury. That's a cross-party campaign, support from SNP MPs down south, but doesn't seem to have the support up here. It's backed by Sir Alex Ferguson, Craig Levine, Gordon Strachan and Alex McLeish. And all of these organisations work and support have highlighted the urgency, the absolute urgency of giving people who are ill because of their job a stronger voice and a fairer deal in terms of employment injuries assistance in Scotland. Nobody, absolutely nobody, should suffer unnecessarily because of the job they once did. Firefighters who keep us safe from burning buildings and toxic fumes are now 3 times more likely to suffer from prostate cancer, leukaemia or esophageal cancer. Right now, they're entitled to absolutely no support from the government in recognition of the role their job played in making them ill. Teachers who worked in classrooms with asbestos are now suffering from mesothelioma, but again entitled to no support. Footballers like Billy McNeill and Gordon McQueen were 3 times more likely than the rest of us to suffer from dementia, but again were entitled to no support for the illness that their job caused. Certainly.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to my colleague Given Way. And we've heard across this chamber throughout this session, and indeed at last we recognise the importance of the lived experience of people to feed into the construction of legislation. And isn't your proposal today the very visual effect of that, of lived experience, people being able to formulate so that going forward, future people have a much better benefit than they've had?
Mark Griffin.
Absolutely. Thank Martin Whitfield for that intervention. It seems strange that we have a current UK industrial injuries system where we have a UK advisory council with medical experts, with trade unionists, with people with lived experience sitting on that council advising government. We devolve the system and we cut out trade unionists, we cut out workers, we cut out people with lived experience and somehow pretend that this Parliament is a more progressive place than the big bad Westminster. It's clearly not. It's clearly failing workers, those with lived experience, those who absolutely deserve a seat at the table to make sure that this newly devolved benefit is absolutely fit for purpose. Presiding Officer, the only reason that I have heard from the Government to oppose this piece of legislation is that it's not the right time. I absolutely cannot accept or understand this argument at all. The Government must produce a business case. In line with their agreement with the Department of Work and Pension, they must devise and publish a business case for the end of March 2025 on the devolution and introduction of this new benefit. That's less than a year away. How can the Government expect to create that business case to devise a fairer system for those who become ill or injured at the work without the very people who have become injured and ill at the work round the table, setting up that new benefit, setting out what the entitlement criteria should be, designing the system from day one? It's a huge omission. Sorry, Mr Mason, I think I'm in my last minute, but I'll be happy to take another intervention at my closing speech. Presiding Officer, I think the time for action is now. This bill represents a crucial opportunity to deliver meaningful change, and I would ask the Government in closing, if not now, then when?
Thank you, Mr Griffin. I now call on Shirley-Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary, around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I want to begin by thanking Mark Griffin for his ongoing commitment to people who have experienced an industrial injury or occupational disease, evidenced by the introduction of this bill. Equally, I want to pay tribute to those who have worked with him in the development of this bill and have given evidence and taken part in that consultation process that he has driven. I also want to express my appreciation to the members of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for their thorough consideration of the bill and a very comprehensive report. I do recognise that there is a degree of support for the concept of a Scottish Advisory Council. I am keenly aware of some of the issues which people have with the UK Government's Industrial Injuries Scheme, many of which the member has referred to in his opening remarks, but primarily related to the current scheme's age and the changes to the employment landscape in over 70 years since its introduction. This is evidenced by the underrepresentation of women, of young people and of ethnic minorities within the current scheme. And I therefore very much appreciate the views of many people who would like changes to be made through employment injury assistance, our planned replacement for the UK scheme, and I share those ambitions. I want to work with stakeholders to modernise the scheme in a way that delivers for the people who receive assistance, while of course delivering value for money. However, while the Government does not oppose the principle of a Scottish Advisory Council, Mr Griffin's bill would introduce such a body without employment injury assistance being in place. As the committee and many of the stakeholders who gave evidence on the bill recognised, consideration of whether and how a Scottish Advisory Council should be formed should be taken alongside the wider question of how we deliver employment injury assistance. It is essential that we do things in the most logical order, both in terms of policy development and in terms of the best use of resources and value for money. And I'll give way to the member.
Daniel Johnson.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. She's just set out that the Government agrees with the principles articulated by Mark Griffin. And given that Stage 1 is about the principles and general purposes of a bill, why is the Government not going to support it at decision time?
Cabinet Secretary.
Because when I agree with the principles about why he's bringing this forward, actually, and I say this with a genuine of great respect to Mark Griffin, who I've had a number of discussions with on this, the concerns that he raised in his opening remarks will not actually be addressed if the Advisory Council is in place. They don't actually help us get any closer to helping the people that the member spoke about. And that's exactly why. And I will go on to explain some of the reasons why it doesn't actually help with that in due course. Until Social Security Scotland is delivering employment injury assistance, we would not be able to act on the recommendations made by the Council. So we would, in effect, have a council, which we will take time to set up, and then the council would, in essence, not be able to have anyone to report to that would enact their recommendations. Now, there is no possibility of renegotiating the agency agreement with the DWP, which are required to ensure the continuing payment of existing awards in Scotland. So I say with the greatest respect again, and I mean this because I do think there is a genuine wish to see a better system here in Scotland. We need to ensure that we're developing the system as a whole, not setting up part of a system which then can't actually have their recommendations put into practice. And it's therefore important to clarify that this bill does not make any changes to the criteria, nor does it mean that the conditions which are not currently covered, such as long COVID, would be considered as an industrial disease. Instead, this bill largely replicates the function of the UK Industrial Injuries Advisory Council, which the committee has heard extensive criticism of. It makes more sense to wait until we have a much better understanding of the level and form of advice and expertise and scrutiny required. And I therefore welcome the conclusions of the Social Justice and Social Securities Committee Stage 1 report, and that report questions whether the body suggested by the member will deliver on its objectives or its names. And I'm happy to give way to the member.
Michael Mara.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. She says that it's more sensible to wait. Does she not realise that for many people with life-debilitating conditions, families suffering, that waiting years and years longer is entirely intolerable?
Cabinet Secretary, and give you the time back for the interventions.
I'm sorry, Presiding Officer.
I can give you the time back for the interventions.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I appreciate that. I do absolutely appreciate why there is frustration and there is impatience, but that's why I would wish to very shortly be able to introduce the consultation and move on with getting people round the table and working out what the new benefit would look like. Because again, and I say this with the greatest of respect, we don't need this bill or indeed any other statutory footing to get people round the table to design a benefit. We haven't needed that for any other benefit, which we have co-designed with people, and we do not need it for this one. So rather than this bill, if it became an act, therefore putting the government into obligation to be setting up a council, we could actually be already getting those people round the table and having those types of discussion without the bill, and I am happy to confirm that we will be doing so. Now, the committee have raised important questions around whether the model of a statutory advisory council that this bill proposes is the right option for employment injury assistance, because what this bill does is set up a council. It does not set up simply something that advises on the development of a benefit. The committee does believe that the creation of an advisory council could add to what can already be a confusing landscape of advice and scrutiny across the UK. This is something I want to take time to carefully consider, including whether and how a future advisory council might work with the Scottish Commission on Social Security. So I ultimately agree with the committee's conclusions that this bill does not represent the most effective way of meeting the aspirations of the many people who do wish to see change in the new system. Replicating a fundamental aspect of the UK system which has been so widely criticised itself, in the absence of proper considerations of the wider purpose, structure and administration of employment injury assistance, is not the right approach. But I do, as I said, appreciate that some people are keen to see changes made more quickly. I've made no secret of how complicated replacing the industrial injury scheme will be. Many of the changes stakeholders want to see, including a greater emphasis on the prevention of workplace disease, are not possible with the powers that we currently have. The scheme as it stands was introduced in 1948 and is delivered almost entirely using a paper-based system. This contrasts with the digital systems we've used for benefits which have been devolved to date. And developing a paper-based replacement will have costs attached, and also, if we include any digital actions of replacement, that will also have costs attached. Additionally, the up to 150,000 files relating to Scottish awards are held in bulky paper case files going back many years. We need to carefully consider how we can do case transfer with the age, condition and the location of those files. And that's important work that we will continue with the UK Government. We are considerably constrained on our ability to make changes in the short term, but I am committed to exploring how employment injury assistance can be reformed so it meets the needs of the people while protecting payments to current clients. To that end, we will launch a consultation on employment injury assistance in the coming weeks, specifically focused on the immediate next steps. That's an important first step in what will be a comprehensive process of engagement with stakeholders and, crucially, with people with lived experience of the current scheme. In the weeks following the launch, meetings with disabled people's organisations and trade unions will be set up, should they so wish to take part, to discuss the range of challenges with replacing the scheme and our next steps, and of course the opportunities that come with that too. In line with our commitments and depending on the outcome of that consultation, that will of course be followed by the establishment of an advisory group. So again, I stress we do not need this bill to have that type of group established. This group will consider the responses to the consultation along many of the issues that have been raised during the evidence sessions on this bill. Given the understandable interest generated by the Members' Bill, I do agree with the committee that it is important that the advisory group carefully consider these offers. If I have time, Presiding Officer?
Very briefly, Miles Briggs.
Can I just ask, what will be the makeup of that advisory group?
Cabinet Secretary, and I would be obliged if you could start winding up now.
Certainly, Presiding Officer. I will say I'm happy to return to that in my closing remarks, but I think particularly people with lived experience, trade union representations and others who have shown an interest during this progress. There's a lot to learn from this bill's progress that we can take forward. But I wish, in closing, Presiding Officer, to reiterate my thanks to Mark Griffin for his work on this important matter. While the Government cannot support the bill, I do appreciate the work that he has done on this, and it will inevitably assist as we develop employment injury assistance in the future.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Before calling the next speaker, there have been a number of interventions already. Just a reminder that as well as asking for an intervention in the normal way, I'd be grateful if members could also press the intervention buttons, which is helpful for those that are joining us online. I now call Colette Stevenson to speak on behalf of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee. Around 7 minutes. Ms Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And on behalf of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee, I am pleased to contribute to this debate. I'd like to thank all the respondents who sent admissions to the committee's call for views, as well as the organisations and individuals that attended committee meetings to provide evidence. And I also would like to thank the clerks for all their assistance in providing an excellent report. In scrutinising the bill, the committee first heard from the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council and the Scottish Commission for Social Security, and we then took evidence from witnesses representing trade unions, occupational health, academia and campaign groups. The bill proposes to create an independent Scotland Employment Injuries Advisory Council, which would, amongst other functions, scrutinise regulations on employment injury assistance, the plan's equivalent to the Industrial Injuries Disablement Benefit. The current Industrial Injuries Scheme and associated benefit has now been in place for more than 3/4 of a century. The scheme was created for a world that is very different to the one that exists now, and Unite the Union in particular have described it as outdated and laborious. Other witnesses we spoke with were similarly critical of the system in place and highlighted its shortcomings. Weaknesses cited included the fact that it is slow to effect change, fails to deliver for women and ethnic minority workers, excuse me, and does not take account of modern occupations and diseases. Scottish Trades Union Congress characterised the system as inherently unequal and inaccessible, with a hugely disproportionate impact on women. What came through clearly in evidence was that the system needs to change, and there was considerable support for the bill among stakeholders. The Fire Brigade Union said in evidence that having the Advisory Council in place is essential to reform the benefit so that it is properly devolved and fit for purpose in the modern day. However, despite the strength of sentiment from witnesses, members of the committee felt uncertain that the bill could bring about the change and modernisation that stakeholders want. Firstly, there was concern about whether the Advisory Council would be able to deliver on its aims and address gaps in data collection, given the limited research budget proposed as part of the bill. Members also questioned whether it would be possible to recruit the expertise needed for an Advisory Council, given that both the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council and the Scottish Commission on Social Security indicated that recruitment has been an issue and the Advisory Council would be seeking people with similar expertise. There is also the question of timing. The Scottish Government argues that to introduce the bill and the associated Advisory Council before employment injury assistance is in place is impractical and financially inappropriate. This is because the Scottish Government's agency agreement with the DWP to deliver the benefit until the case transfer is complete means it must abide by the DWP policy. Ministers would therefore be unable to act on any of the Council's recommendations, even if the bill were to pass. The Scottish Government also said that once employment injury assistance is in place, it would still not make changes to it while some claimants' awards are being delivered by the DWP. This is because to do so would risk the creation of a two-tier system, with some potentially better off than others. Another point of opposition is that the Scottish Government has said it is committed to holding a public consultation on its approach to replacing the Industrial Injuries Scheme in Scotland. It considers this is a more appropriate way of considering whether to enact a new public body, because the question of whether to create this can be considered alongside other questions related to the new scheme. In its Stage 1 report, the committee notes concern that the creation of an Advisory Council could add to an already cluttered policy landscape. Either way, the committee is very concerned that it is still not clear when the consultation will begin, and calls on the Scottish Government to urgently provide information on this. The committee notes that in the Cabinet Secretary's written response to the Stage 1 report, she said that the Scottish Government intended to publish its consultation in early 2024, and given it is now April, the committee urges the Scottish Government to provide updated timings. An associated issue that arose during the committee's scrutiny was the time required to complete case transfer of the benefit, as more than 100,000 paper files need to be converted to a digital format. And while the Cabinet Secretary picked up on this point in her response to the committee's Stage 1 report, we seek a further update on the progress of this, as well as the expected completion date. Returning to the merits of the bill, while the committee recognises the good intentions of the member in charge in bringing it forward, ultimately the majority of the committee could not support it. While we were all persuaded that major reform of industrial injuries benefits is indeed needed, most of the committee remain unconvinced that the bill can deliver the reform that is sought, and we do not want its passage to falsely raise expectations. I also felt the timing was not right, and given the expected Scottish Government consultation and the fact that ministers will remain constrained by the agency agreement with the DWP until case transfer is complete. Recommendations made by the Advisory Council would therefore not be able to be acted upon. It is for these reasons that the committee recommends that the general principles of the bill are not agreed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Stevenson. I now call Jeremy Balfour up to 6 minutes. Mr Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate. As a member of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee, I spent a great deal of time over the last number of months carefully considering this bill. I generally do want to commend Mark Griffin for the time and effort he has put into this process. I know from personal experience that a member's bill requires no small level of effort and dedication to get to this point. I also want to make mention of his parliamentary staff, who I know have done a lot of work to support the member to get to where we are today. Can I also thank the committee clerks for the work that they put in helping us produce this report this afternoon. Unfortunately, despite this, I will not be able to support the general principles of the bill as we see it today. While I agree with a number of the underlying assumptions of Mr Griffin, we on these benches do not believe the establishment of a Scottish Employment Advisory Council at this time is the best way forward. One of the most unfortunate aspects of the context surrounding this bill is that it has been brought forward at too early a stage. As clear from the title, the body the bill seeks to establish is closely linked to the Employment Injury Assistance Benefit. Unfortunately, the Scottish Government are still waiting for EIA to be devolved 8 years on from the passing of the Social Security Act of 2016. It would seem that we are still nowhere near the Scottish Government taking over the administration of EIA, and as such we are far from needing an advisory board to oversee it. Even if for a moment we accept the premise that such a board is strictly necessary for the implementation of this benefit, if we establish it now, they would be in a post for goodness knows how long before actually having any work to undertake. It would be neither financially or practically sensible to do so. Of course.
Mark Griffin.
No, the point has been made on timing. You know, we're at a stage 1 debate. We've still got stage 2, stage 3, royal assent and commencement. You know, we are nowhere near a council being established overnight, and there's only a year until the government needs a business case. We're going to be fast running out of time to get a council in place, never mind being too early.
Jeremy Balfour.
Again, I understand where the member's coming from, but I think the point is, and what we have done with every other benefit with, I think, cross-party support on this, is that we have done a safe and secure transfer. That means we haven't looked at changing the rules and regulations of the benefit until everyone is in receipt and has been administrated here from Scotland. And unless the Cabinet Secretary is going to correct me, my understanding is that is what the government want to do here as well. So it will be at least 2 to 3 years before we're in a place to be able to do that. But as I said, even if the timing had been perfect, I'm afraid I am not convinced that such a committee is the best way forward. The devolution of social security was meant to be an opportunity for a radically different social security system that addressed the unique landscape in Scotland. We should have had an unprecedented, we were left or had an opportunity to create a system that has looked exactly as we wanted it to be. Instead, the government took the view that we would follow carbon copy of the DWP in every other way except for the delivery, which has been less than smooth. Now, I will admit that the reality has been that there have been limits to the extent in which we could have deviated from the previous system. But it is clear that the Scottish Government has in no way tried to make any meaningful changes and is not going to bring meaningful changes in this Parliament. Hiding behind the facade of a safe and secure transition, we have abdicated the responsibility they sought so hard for. This could be an opportunity to make a difference. There could be other ways to support the administration of EIA, other than a council that could represent better value for money, as well as a better fulfilling the needs. It will be no surprise to the Chamber that we on these benches are generally sceptical of the creation of new levels of bureaucracy where there are other possible solutions. I would like to see more innovation from the government on this point, and as such, this adds to the case against the bill before us today. As a Chamber, we will be aware we as a committee have called on the government to publish a consultation on employment injuries. The work that Mr Griffin has done has shed light on the fact that we must make quicker progress on this issue. We are unable to get a straight answer to the timing of the government's plans for a consultation, and the Cabinet Secretary in her opening remarks said in a number of weeks. I wonder whether in her closing, or even now.
Cabinet Secretary, briefly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Happy to confirm that I did wish to wait to see what happened today, because, quite frankly, there was no point in a consultation if Parliament had agreed to go forward with this bill and set up an advisory council. But the consultation is ready, and it will be very soon, within the next few weeks, we will be able to do that.
Jeremy Balfour, I'd be obliged if you could start winding up, please.
Absolutely. And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that? Presiding Officer, as I said at the outset, Mr Griffin and his team have undertaken a lot of good work to get his bill to this point. He has shed light on the delays in the devolution of EIA, and I hope focus the government's eyes on this issue. However, unfortunately, we will not be supporting the general principles at decision time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Paul O'Kane, up to 6 minutes. Mr O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to open on behalf of Scottish Labour in this Stage 1 debate, and I am pleased to be supporting the general principles of my colleague Mark Griffin's bill. And I want to begin by paying tribute to Mark Griffin, to his team, past and present, and to everyone who has assisted, not least those from the trade union movement and workers across Scotland in the preparation of this bill. And I think today what Mark Griffin has outlined is in the best traditions of the Labour Party and the Labour movement, representing working people in Parliament and giving voice to their real concerns and driving forward the change they need to see. That is where we have always been, and it is where we remain today. And I think we've already started to hear many of the excuses that are being lined up by the government and the Conservative benches about why they will not support Mark Griffin's bill. And I think that will be a real disappointment to those working people who are watching this debate today and who have been part of the process of consultation and development of this bill. Because I think, as has been outlined, timing has been mentioned a lot already. The reality is we have seen, I think, delay and confusion very often around what is happening in the development of employability assistance here in Scotland. And I think, as Mark Griffin outlined, if you could just give me one moment, I'll come to the Cabinet Secretary. He made very clear, I think, in his intervention on Jeremy Balfour about the need for these things to be put in place, because we are a long way off still from any Industrial Injuries Council being put in place. But I'll give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to the member. Can I clarify that any changes to the timetables on which we are looking to deliver employment injury assistance is based on two issues. One, COVID, when both the DWP and the Scottish Government had to reassess their work plans, and also the delivery of the Scottish Child Payment, which I'm sure the member will appreciate was a very big undertaking, but a very important one.
Paul O'Kane.
I would remind the Cabinet Secretary that when she came to the Social Justice and Social Security Committee and gave evidence, she spoke about consultation come forward early in the new year, and we spoke about the consultation. We're now in April. I understand what she has said in the course of the debate today, but I think the delay has really caused deep concern for people about the progress of this benefit and making sure that we get the right assistance for people who deserve it. And I do think that's why it's incumbent on Parliament to support this bill in order to make forward movement in this area. And of course I recognise, as stakeholders do, that the bill won't introduce the benefit and it doesn't outline what the benefit at this stage would look like, but it sets up the key components that will be needed when that benefit comes forward, because expert advice and workers' voices will be required to ensure that the right illnesses, injuries and disabilities are covered, and we believe that an advisory council as proposed is the right vehicle for that. Because the proposals, as outlined by my colleague Mark Griffin, make it independent from government, gender balanced, with permanent representation from workers to carry out its own research, and critically, in my view, compared to the alternatives that could exist, puts the body on a statutory footing, so government can't just disband it, as it has done with other advisory groups, such as the ACBAG. And I think what was striking for me in all of the evidence, if you just allow me to finish this point, what was striking for me as a member of the committee in all of the evidence that we heard was the widespread support from stakeholders and the very little opposition to it. So I'll give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary, briefly.
I'm grateful again, Presiding Officer. Can the member tell me whether he agrees that we should continue with a medical definition of disability, as is in the current scheme, or does he think we should change to a more social definition of disability? Because if he doesn't know the answer to that question, I think that points to why we need to look at the benefit of the whole, because depending on how the member wishes to define disability depends on the type of support mechanisms and indeed whether an advisory council is needed and what it looks like.
Paul O'Kane.
I think, as we've said throughout, we're interested in the lived experience element of this and in people talking about their experience of disability, which would suggest there is that model of people's experience in the social model. So I don't understand why the Cabinet Secretary wouldn't support workers and people with that lived experience giving voice to that through the Council in terms of what is being proposed today. And I think on the point I was leading with in terms of the support for this bill, the trade union movement, as I have said, support this bill, with Ross Foyer of the STUC commenting just this week that by rejecting Mark Griffin's bill, the Scottish Government would be sending out the message that workers injured at their work and now in need of assistance from the state can be disregarded or ignored. And we know that it has the support of organisations who recognise that this is not the end of the road in terms of employment injuries, but is a step in the direction to getting voices heard and those calls for assistance. And those are groups like Action on Asbestos, Long COVID Scotland and the Injury Time campaign, ably led by my friend and colleague Michael Mara and supported by legends of the game in Scotland, as we've heard already. All of those people speaking about the hazards that they experienced in work and the need to be covered by employment injury assistance. And that has to be an expert body looking at the evidence and making recommendations. And they consistently told us that the Advisory Council was a step in the right direction towards that. Certainly.
Briefly, Michael Mara.
I appreciate the member giving way, but you recognise that those many high-profile former players in the Scottish football have backed our campaign, the Injury Time campaign, but many of them have no time to wait. They are in their injury time, they are living with families, they are putting huge pressure on their families to pay for their care. Now really is the time where they need action from this government to actually act so they can get the support that they need.
Paul O'Kane.
I completely agree with the points made by Michael Mara and has been made by Mark Griffin as well, that people are running out of time in order to have this justice, this sense of injustice in many ways, fixed and sorted and have their voice, crucially, heard in that process as we develop this benefit. Presiding Officer, in drawing my remarks to a conclusion, I think what is clear today that the SNP's failure to move forward at pace and purpose on these issues and their failure to support this bill is another failure to support workers and working people in this country. It would appear today that the Government want to give us warm words about their support of the general principles of the bill, but not put that into action by backing the bill at decision time. It seems to me that they are only interested in paying lip service to Scotland's workers and trade union movement and never actually carrying forward the policies that are needed with any sense of urgency. So, as I said at the outset, Scottish Labour will always be the party of working people in Scotland, and that is why we are pleased to support the bill at stage 1.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. As we move into the open debate, just a reminder of what time we had in hand. It has now been exhausted and members will now need to stick to their speaking time allocations, including if they take interventions. And with that, I call John Mason to be followed by Ros McCall. Up to 4 minutes, please, Mr Mason. Pardon, 6 minutes, Mr Mason.
Thank you for that reassurance. To start on a positive note, I think both the committee as a whole and I myself personally are convinced that the present UK system for employment injuries and industrial injury disablement benefit are seriously out of date and not fit for purpose. The UK system was designed for a time of mining and heavy engineering with predominantly male workers, but times have changed and there is a need to include a whole range of different employments, as we've heard, including teaching and football being just two examples. The system has not adapted to modern times, where there is a much wider range of injuries and diseases recognised, including stress and mental ill health, along with relatively recent conditions like long COVID. We had helpful evidence in all of this from a range of witnesses, including the Royal College of Nursing, the Fire Brigades Union, who spoke about their members developing cancer, and also campaigners, as we've heard, for footballers with head injuries, and the NAS UWT made the point that only 13% of new claims are made by women. So I do not think there is any dispute about the need for change. The question is how and when that change can and should come about. I am relatively recently on the Social Justice and Social Security Committee, but it seems clear that transferring UK benefits from the DWP to Social Security Scotland is a major challenge in itself. The transfer process often takes longer than expected, and in this case it seems that many files are still held entirely on paper, whereas previous transfers have involved digital records. And I am persuaded that the first step has to be that transfer, and only then, once we are in full control of all the casework, can we really look at amending the UK system for employment injuries. Hopefully we can work towards a more inclusive and caring approach, but I think we have to accept that all of this will take time. I do think Mark Griffin makes a fair point that we need to have appropriate experts, certainly including people with lived experience, feeding into the design of a new Scottish system. And apart from anything else, the IIAC cannot advise Scottish ministers, so we will need to find a solution to that. Whether there should be a new advisory council or perhaps an existing body taking on extra responsibilities is a very pertinent question and will need to be answered. Personally, I have reservations about setting up yet another public body in a relatively small country like Scotland, so I have to say I am not convinced that setting up this proposed council at this time is really the appropriate next step. When it comes to finance and the financial memorandum, we can argue whether specific items, like the fairly modest research budget of £30,000 per year, is really sufficient. We heard that at the UK level, much of the research is carried out by IIAC members in their own time, but that does not strike me as a satisfactory model for us to follow. Perhaps more seriously, we heard that the present UK system is very slow at acting on recommendations from the IIAC, for example with illnesses relating to COVID. Now, we could set up our own advisory council immediately and then largely ignore its output, as the UK seems to do. However, that does not strike me as at all satisfactory. I want to see a much improved system in Scotland which adapts quickly to new conditions like COVID and to increase understanding of conditions around mental health. Now, Parliament knows that the Finance Committee has concerns about the number of framework bills and their FMs, mainly brought forward by the Government, which we are expected to examine. One of the key problems with such bills is that only the costs strictly pertaining to the actual bill are included in the financial memorandum. So even if it can be clearly seen that much larger costs are inevitably going to follow on, these are not included, and the National Care Service bill was an example of that. Now, today's bill may not technically be a framework bill, but a similar problem arises. If we set up an advisory council and it starts churning out recommendations as to which new groups of people should be receiving employment injury assistance, then potentially the costs are going to rise and rise. Now, morally, I do agree that many more people than at present should be considered for the new EIA, and we should all be working to make that happen. And I also accept that such a new system might well save money in the long run. However, we also have to live in the short term, with the financial constraints put upon us. There is just not the money there to increase payments substantially, however well-deserved and needed they may be. If we in Scotland are to be fairer than Westminster has been in paying people what they deserve and need, I'm afraid that that money will not come from the DWP. Let's remember that in this year's budget we increased social security spending by some £1 billion, while most other budgets were being squeezed. We cannot afford to keep on repeating such increases. Longer term, I would hope that we could address this challenge. The trade unions gave evidence to the committee, and I would pay tribute to the STUC at this point and their proposals as to how we should raise more tax in this country. Because, like it or not, when we consider policy and legislation in Parliament, we need to take account of what the costs are likely to be, both in the short term and in the longer term. Just this week, representatives of the OECD have been in Edinburgh to carry out a review of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. They met with both the Social Justice Committee and the Finance Committee, and one of the points that came up was that all subject committees in the Parliament, not just the Finance Committee, need to consider the financial impact of any changes that we are looking to make. So for all these reasons, I'm afraid that I cannot support this bill. The overall aims and direction of travel I am fully on board with. However, I do not believe that creating an advisory council is the best place to start. And I also would argue that we need to fully think through the inevitable costs that would follow on from such a bill, not just the costs that are narrowly defined within it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mason, and apologies again for attempting to slash your speaking time. I now call Ros McCall to be followed by Marie McNair. Up to 6 minutes, Ms McCall.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would also like to begin my contribution this afternoon by congratulating Mark Griffin on getting his bill to stage 1. I've met with Mr Griffin on this, and I know how passionately he is on this topic, and I think we could all hear that with his initial contribution. I understand this process can be somewhat cumbersome, and I appreciate the amount of work that is required to get to this stage, so I do congratulate Mr Griffin and all involved on what he's managed to achieve so far. As a member of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee, which was tasked with scrutinising the proposal, can I also place on record my thanks to the clerks for their diligent work on drafting such a comprehensive report, and to everyone that came to give evidence. As members will be aware, the bill aims to create an independent Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council, which would have 3 functions: to scrutinise regulations on the Employment Injury Assistance, EIA, report on any matters relevant to EIA, to carry out, commission or support research into any matter relevant to EIA. The bill would also mandate the membership and the membership balance of the Advisory Council, including the representation of workers on the Council. So in examining the bill and working with through its initial stages, I think all members of the committee kept an open mind, and they have based their conclusions on the findings. The committee heard evidence from trade unions and other stakeholders on the need for change. For example, evidence highlighted the current system's unequal treatment of particular groups, with the STUC noting that the present system is inherently unequal and inaccessible and has a hugely disproportionate impact on women, when they stated that everything is gendered, from the lens that it is seen through, the industrial injuries that it covers, and the accessibility to women of its processes. We need to think about how we can modernise and change that. And the NASUWT also agreed that the current benefit is unequal, discriminatory, and I was shocked to hear that up to December 2019, only 13.5% of all new claims were made by women. There was also strong evidence for the need to reform and modernise the way in which the industrial injury scheme operates in Scotland, in particular who is eligible for EIA. Unite, for example, emphasised the historical nature of the scheme and the need for a new system that's fit for a modern Scottish workplace and emerging industries. And they noted the current system is outdated, laborious, it does not cover a myriad of new and existing diseases experienced by workers in the 21st century. In essence, their argument, and that of several other witnesses, was that the model of work has changed significantly over the last 50 years, and that's a compelling one. We also heard how the current system is slow and ineffectual, and that people are missing out on assistance which could positively impact their lives. Change is therefore needed, and I agree with the conclusions of the committee report. But the question is, what is the right way to secure that change? And I'm afraid I do not believe that this bill is the right way to do that. Firstly, as the Scottish Government is still to move forward with transfer from the DWP, who continue to administer industrial injuries benefit until at least March 2026. The Advisory Council would therefore duplicate the work of an existing UK body. We heard evidence from Professor MacDonald that the Advisory Council were to examine the same issues as the UK body, then there will be a duplication of research, which is wasteful. Because the same diseases are occurring internationally, why do we have to do everything ourselves? I agree wholeheartedly with this sentiment, as the legislation would establish a body which would broadly mirror the existing UK body. So then I find myself asking the question, if the UK body... Sorry, one second, if I could just finish this bit and then happy to take an intervention. If the UK body is not fit for purpose and slow to effect change, then why would we want to duplicate these issues onto a new Scottish body? Happy to take an intervention.
Claire Baker.
I recognise our points about international research, but does Schwab accept that there are particular challenges in Scotland, given our industrial background, and we know that our figures are higher than the rest of the UK when it comes to workplace fatalities and other areas? I think there are particular challenges in Scotland that an advisory council could be helpful in addressing.
Rose McCall.
Whilst I accept that, I also think there are charities that can provide additional information, and I'm still not sure that moving forward with this body is the right way to go. However, my main concern centres on the fact that this bill wishes to deal with a benefit that doesn't exist yet, which is the EIA. Instead, we have a situation where the DWP will continue to deal with this area for at least another 2 years, and then the Scottish Government will be launching a lengthy consultation process, which I hope will get additional information. And indeed, the committee noted during evidence that there's still not a definitive timescale on the completion of that consultation, but I do note that the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned that not only in her opening comments, but has also answered interventions on that. And I am looking forward to that coming forward as a matter of urgency. So in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, I acknowledge the good intentions of the bill. I have noted some of the evidence about the deficiencies in the current system, and I wholeheartedly accept the need for change. However, unfortunately, I think that due to the Scottish Government's inaction on coming forward with a proposal of how they intend to deal with EIA, this legislation is putting the cart before the horse. That's not Mr Griffin's problem, I accept that. But it does make the bill unworkable in my view, and it risks duplication of the existing work. So on balance, therefore, I cannot agree to the principles of the bill at stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McCall. I now call Marie McNair to be followed by Richard Leonard, up to 6 minutes. Ms McNair.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the interest of time, I don't plan to take any interventions. I've got a lot to say. So I speak in this debate as a member of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee in line with our report on this bill. And I thank the committee clerks for their assistance with the production of a report. The evidence we received from many experts, including trade unions, was invaluable in getting an illustration of how the current scheme has excluded so many and ignored their experiences of being injured in the workplace, especially women. Why this hasn't been allowed to go on for so long is astonishing. And I thank Mark Griffin for introducing this bill, and I understand his intentions are genuine and he's done a lot of work in this regard. I believe that the effort he's put into this matter and the evidence he gathered has shone a considerable light on the significant failings of the UK-wide Industrial Injuries Disablement Scheme. It is a scheme that, despite its antiquity, has been left largely unreformed and been unresponsive and lacking in any acknowledgement of the realities and experience of the emerging working environment over many years. We now know its warehouse is full of paper files and no way to run a modern social security system with dignity, fairness and justice at its heart. I am therefore supportive of any change that takes us in the right path to justice for many who have been denied access to this support, and that is how I approached our evidence sessions on the bill. As the MSP who covers the area of Clydebank, a constituency plagued by the tragic legacy of asbestos-related health conditions, and who has spent considerable time working with the Clydebank Asbestos Group, I have a particular interest in industrial injuries benefits and the need to ensure the new benefit meets the values of fairness, dignity and respect. Every worker deserves to return home from work free of harm or injury. Speaking from the Clydebank perspective, unfortunately this has not been the case for many, due to the historical use of the asbestos in shipbuilding and the asbestos in the built environment, leading to asbestos-related health conditions like mesothelioma. I look forward to the introduction of the Scottish Government's replacement benefit, employment injury assistance, to be administered by Scottish Social Security Scotland on our behalf. For the committee, we kept an open mind about this bill, and it was difficult weighing up all the arguments presented to us. One main concern about this bill is whether the timing is appropriate given the current approach taken by the Scottish Government to delivery of new benefits. And importantly, the Scottish Government needs to ensure the safe and secure transfer of benefits, and this involves the use of a Department of Work and Pensions agency agreement, which enables the DWP to continue to deliver the benefit in Scotland. As the Scottish Government pointed out, even once it introduces a Scottish version of a benefit, it does so with minimal change until the transfer of the case is complete, because the Scottish Government would not want to introduce inequality to those transferred. Further, there are concerns that given the limited research budget, whether there is a significant expertise to actually sustain a statutory advisory council, as we heard that recruitment was an issue with both the UK Industrial Injuries Advisory Council and the Scottish Commission on Social Security. When recommending whether to establish a new statutory body with all the costs discussed, the committee has to be sure that the body can really meet its aims. And it's clear to me and members of the committee that major reform of industrial injuries benefit is needed, but we're not convinced that this bill would secure this, as the scope to deliver the scale of the change required is years away. While the committee did fully consider the evidence and arguments for and against, unfortunately, the timing is a major concern, and at this point, the timing is wrong, and so cannot support the bill, as there's doubt that it will achieve its aims, particularly in times of fiscal constraint. The evidence does emphasise the need for expertise in guiding the way forward, and I welcome the commitment from the Cabinet Secretary that a stakeholder group will be set up, and it's clear that this expertise has not been listened to for so long. In our summing up, will the Cabinet Secretary guarantee that groups like Clydebank Asbestos Group will be included in this stakeholder group? The expertise and knowledge of these experienced has long been ignored, and this, I'm sure, is part of the reason we're inheriting this unjust and neglectful policy from Westminster. So, on balance, the committee is not able to support the general principles of this bill. What the bill has helped fully expose is the lack of interest that the Westminster Parliament has shown in this issue, and the fact that this legislation has been in place since 1948 and has been mostly unreformed is a significant injustice. They have been asleep at the wheel at best and a denier of support to many who, at the end of the day, were just doing their job, and workers need a safer environment and compensation and support when needed. And how can this issue be ignored for so long by Westminster governments of all persuasion? And as such, the committee recommends the Parliament that the general principles of the bill can't be agreed as it stands. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms McNair. I now call Richard Elena to be followed by Maggie Chapman. Up to 6 minutes. Mr. Elena.
Deputy Presiding Officer, can I remind members of my trade union affiliations recorded in my voluntary register of interest? And let me begin with that, because the Scottish Trades Union Congress has been convening in Dundee just this week. And as late as yesterday morning, it reaffirmed its backing for this bill, which this afternoon this government is planning to oppose. The PFA and the Injury Time campaign, deeply troubled about neurodegenerative diseases amongst former professional footballers. The FBU, intensely alarmed about the carcinogenic exposure of firefighters. Union after union, gravely concerned about long COVID. And as a result, an entire trade union movement in Scotland united in demanding urgent action from this government to tackle the deep and blatant inequalities of this present system of industrial injuries disablement benefit. And they all see this bill, all of them, as a decisive first step. And they are not alone. The government's own Disability and Carers Benefit Expert Advisory Group, established in 2017 to advise ministers on benefits, including Employment Injury Assistance also recommended that a Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council be set up, but that recommendation has never been implemented and the government has wound the expert advisory group up. And then there is the evidence to this Parliament from experts, practitioners like Dr Mark Simpson, interim co-chair of the Scottish Commission on Social Security, who told us, I quote, expertise in social security and expertise in industrial injuries are two quite distinct things. Absolutely clear in his evidence that, and I quote him, if a body were to be set up on a statutory footing with a formal requirement for it to be consulted, it would be harder for such expertise to be ignored. And what is this Cabinet Secretary's response? A mixture of improper appeals, false pretences and moral evasions. That the government is intending on a more wide-ranging public consultation of its own. Well, where is it? We've been promised a wide-ranging public consultation on employment injury assistance every year for the last 5 years. Then we are told we don't need legislation to get things done, when the whole point is nothing is being done. We are then informed that there is now a plan to set up a stakeholder group. But such a group, if it ever sees the light of day, will be non-statutory. It could be ditched at any time, just like the stakeholder group on disability and carers benefits was ditched. And then, best of all, we are expected to believe that it is all too complicated, because here is a benefit which is not digitised but run from a paper system stored in a number of warehouses. This, remember, from a government whose party's very founding purpose is to create and then run, in a matter of weeks, an entire separate Scottish state. This must go down in the 90-year history of the SNP as the most risible excuse for inaction ever. And as for the safe and secure transition as a cause for further delay, as Anna Ritchie-Allen of Close the Gap, who support this bill, explained to Parliament, a safe and secure transition is code for, in her words, business as usual, replicating a system that disadvantages women and increases the inequality they face. Questions have also been raised about the cost to the state, the cost to the Scottish Government of modernising the industrial injuries benefit system. But what about the cost to the individual worker? What about the cost to their families? What about the cost to them? And as for costs, this simple advisory body, which would be created with this bill, will help prevent occupational injury and disease, and so will help the NHS, will help local government social services, will help the welfare of these workers, whose only aim is to be able to live a decent, dignified life. This bill rests literally on the principle that an injury to one is an injury to all, which leads me to my final point. Anyone who looks at the incidence of ill health by occupation or of mortality by age must understand that we live in a class-based society, and so that what the Scottish Government is doing today is reinforcing all of those old inequalities, is defending that old class system. It is turning its back on all of those injured, disabled, working people in Scotland struggling in adversity. Those who are denied justice by the present system, that is what they're doing. And that is what all of those SNP and Green MSPs will be doing tonight if they vote with the party whip and with the Tories to kill this bill at its very first stage. They will be letting down. They will be voting against. They will be betraying an entire class. And for that, they should hang their heads in shame.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. I now call Maggie Chapman to be followed by Graham Simpson. Up to 6 minutes, Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before I begin, I remind colleagues of my trade union membership as recorded on my register of interests. I'd like to begin by paying tribute to Mark Griffin for all the work he has put into his bill and the wider issues of support and compensation for people made unwell, injured or disabled at or by their work. I'd also like to thank the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for their detailed scrutiny of the bill's proposals and for their report published earlier this year. I'm sorry not to be a member of that committee, so not to have played a full part in that scrutiny, but I did try to follow the evidence sessions as best I could. I pay tribute too to the many trade unions, individuals and other organisations who contributed not only to the committee's scrutiny of this bill, but, as Mark Griffin has outlined, have also campaigned for years to have the issues outlined by him earlier today properly recognised and addressed. Scottish Greens believe that nobody should suffer as a consequence of what they do for work, because of an injury, illness or disability that happens in or develops because of their workplace. I think that this is something on which we can all agree. In our view, the extension of this belief is that people who do unfortunately suffer an industrial injury or develop an occupational disease should be appropriately supported and compensated. I agree that we must reform and modernise the industrial benefits scheme we have had in place for over 70 years. There are significant improvements we need to see, some of which we've heard about this afternoon already, and I want to highlight just a couple of these. The Chamber will be aware of the ongoing decon campaign by the Fire Brigades Union. Firefighting is now recognised by the World Health Organization as a carcinogenic profession. It is clear that we should recognise this and not only act to provide the best possible protections for firefighters as they do their important life-saving jobs, but also ensure that if they are diagnosed with diseases that are a consequence of their work, they are appropriately supported and compensated. I ask the Cabinet Secretary to confirm in her closing statement a commitment to work with her colleagues in Justice, with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and the FBU to ensure the future employment injury assistance system is available to firefighters. I would also ask the Cabinet Secretary to give an assurance to the Chamber this afternoon that in the work to be undertaken in the coming months, the following issues are clearly addressed. The committee heard that current approaches to workplace health and safety often ignore women's specific occupational illnesses and injuries. The Employment Injuries Assistance Benefit must not be gender blind. The STUC and Close the Gap have clearly highlighted the fact that women are vastly underrepresented within the current industrial injuries disability benefit system, accounting for only 16% of those claiming IIDB. Occupational injuries and illnesses associated with women-dominated work, such as social care and retail, are often ignored, underdiagnosed, under-researched, undercompensated. Scotland's EIA must not replicate this inequality and injustice. As others have said, we want the system we designed for Scotland to be inclusive, supportive and effective. I do not envy those with the task of digitising all those paper records we've heard about, but I wish them well. I also hope that the conversations that need to happen to ensure the EIA system we develop is fit for purpose can start and continue apace, so that we don't leave people waiting for the support they deserve any longer than absolutely necessary. In closing, Presiding Officer, I once again thank Mark Griffin for making us all much more aware of the weaknesses in the current system of support for those with industrial injuries or occupational diseases. I thank him for the conversations we've had about these issues over the last couple of years. I think that he has ensured the system we do end up developing in Scotland will be better than it otherwise might have been, and I thank him for that. I look forward to working with him, the Cabinet Secretary and others as work on this issue continues in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call Graham Simpson to be followed by Bob Doris, who will be the final speaker in the open debate. Mr Simpson, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And can I also start by congratulating Mark Griffin on getting his bill to this stage, because getting a member's bill through the system is no easy matter. It's time-consuming and it can be frustrating. So he's done really well, and he must have been full of hope at one point that his proposal might become law. until he read the committee report. Now, negative committee reports have not always been the death knell of members' bills. I've certainly seen a couple which have managed to get over that hurdle, but there's an element of luck involved, and there's certainly a lot of politics. There's always the risk that other parties will just reject your proposal because you're not one of them. But that shouldn't happen, but it does happen. Listening to what's been said so far, I think Mr Griffin is out of luck. He probably knows that. And that's a pity, because this stage of proceedings is to decide whether we agree with the general principles of the bill, which are that we should create a Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council to provide for its functions in relation to employment injury assistance and for connected purposes. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't ask to speak in this debate. I knew nothing about the bill until my name appeared on my party's whip. But if they're going to get me to speak in a debate about something that has not troubled me previously, then I thought I'm going to do Mr Griffin the courtesy of not falling back on the lazy way out of just asking what is our position. So after reading the bill, I turned to the committee report, which was useful. And it tells us that the bill would create an independent Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council with 3 functions. They are to scrutinise regulations on employment injury assistance, that's EIA, report on any matter relevant to EIA, and carry out, commission or support research into any matter relevant to EIA. The bill also mandates the membership and membership balance of the Advisory Council, including the representation of workers on the Council. So far so good. But skip to the end of the report and we find the committee full of praise for Mr Griffin and his good intentions, but saying it's not able to support the general principles. Paul O'Kane, who's not here at the moment, dissented from that, though his Labour colleague on the committee, Katie Clark, appears not to have done so. I don't know why that was the case, but the question is, with the honourable exception of Mr O'Kane, how have the committee arrived at such a conclusion, and do I agree with them? And my starting point is that benefit that Mr Griffin wishes his bill to deal with, EIA. It currently doesn't exist because although the Scottish Government could set it up, it hasn't, preferring instead to have their good friends in the DWP to continue to administer industrial injuries benefits under an agreement which runs at least until the end of March 2026. It's good to see Mr O'Kane back. Someone can tell him how I was praising him earlier. The UK Government has its own advisers. Yes, I'll certainly take an intervention, but welcome an intervention.
Thank you. I'm always very grateful to hear that I'm being praised when I'm momentarily absent from the chamber. However, I understand that he referred to my colleague Katie Clark, who actually I believe was absent the day we voted on the committee report from committee. So just for the clarity and the record.
Graham Simpson.
That's a useful explanation, and it's a shame she's also absent today unless she's online. It would have been good to hear what she thinks. Now, Mr Griffin is suggesting that the Scottish Government has some of its own advisers, if and when they get round to setting up their own benefit in this area, or indeed in advance of this, in order to advise on how the benefit should operate here. The difficulty with all this is that the Scottish Government is showing no urgency in wanting to do this. It seems content for the DWP. I see another intervention, but I'm afraid, Mr Griffin, I'm not getting any extra time. If the presiding officer is generous, I'd be happy to take... she's shaking her head. I'm really sorry, Mr Griffin. So the reality is, if this was easy, the Scottish Government would have done it already. They would be shouting from the rooftops about its latest game-changer benefit. And I think this is where the problem lies. My issue is not with Mr Griffin or his bill. It's just the reality of the situation is that we could create a body with nothing to do. Perish the thought. My guess is that the Cabinet Secretary, Katie Clark, so you'll have to tell Katie Clark, if she's listening, that I cannot take her in. I have no time. My guess is that the Cabinet Secretary has no intention whatsoever of creating a new benefit anytime soon. She will ask the DWP to carry on beyond March 2026. She will continue to promise to consult on how advice could be provided on industrial injuries, and it won't lead anywhere. We're a little over 2 years away from the next Scottish Parliament elections. Mr Griffin must know that nothing is going to happen between now and then. After that, who knows, perhaps he'll be in a position to change things. Sadly for me, his well-meaning proposal falls because it relies on a Scottish Government that is dysfunctional and dithering.
You must conclude. Thank you. And I call Bob Doris, the final speaker in the open debate.
Presiding Officer, as Deputy Convener of our Parliament's Social Justice Committee, I had direct involvement in the scrutiny of the legislation we've been asked to consider at stage 1 this afternoon. In the first instance, I want to thank the member in charge of the bill and the team of dedicated people who will no doubt have supported Mr Griffin in the bill's development, as well as all those who gave evidence to the committee in both written and oral forum. The Scottish Government must draw on the learning that we got during that evidence and from Mr Griffin, and they must use it when they bring forward their own legislation. There was much agreement in the committee that there is a real opportunity to reform and modernise the system of industrial benefits here in Scotland. Not least of all, we heard powerful evidence that the current pan-UK system is widely considered to be highly genderised. There was clear agreement of the need to collect better quality data at a more granular and workplace level, and for there to be far greater role for workers and their representatives. Indeed, I wish the committee could have looked in greater detail at how current structures operate. I would like to have explored the role of the Health and Safety Executive within existing structures. I was therefore deeply disappointed that they refused to give oral evidence to our committee, although they did eventually provide some written evidence. Whilst not entirely ideal, I do offer my thanks that they did so. I do, however, look forward to this Parliament having the power to compel organisations to attend in the future. Also, the Health and Safety Executive has a seat on the UK Advisory Council. You understand why I would want them to appear at a Scottish Parliament committee. Not acceptable. One ambition in the Employment Injury Advisory Council which should be considered by the Scottish Government that Mr Griffin was seeking to establish is the proactive and preventative agenda, mainly through research in Mr Griffin's bill, but more generally there's a wider need for that. I think there's more that can be done in that area. We would all much rather like to prevent injury than someone needing to claim employment injury assistance in the first place. Any new system of data collection on workplace injuries and analysis and exploration of trends that may emerge and recommendations that may emerge from that to address workplace safety and worker safety, it must ensure key partnership between employers and trade unions. Occupational health, I think, have got a key role to play as well, as do the Health and Safety Executive, despite my comments, and many others. I do note that at decision time today I will not vote the way the STUC would like me to vote, and I acknowledge that, but I do also acknowledge that the STUC would like to see the devolution of health and safety to this Parliament, and just recently of employment law as well, and I think that would really give us all the tools that we need in this Parliament to deliver for workers in Scotland. Can I say that much of the evidence the committee heard revolved around how any Scottish system could evaluate and add a range of existing or new conditions for industrial injury, from long COVID to dementia and football, from Scotland's health and care sector to our fire service that Maggie Chapman very eloquently spoke about. We need to be clear, however, that Mark Griffin's bill will not change who qualifies for any new employment injury assistance. Indeed, clearly, self-evidently, the benefit doesn't exist yet. I don't think that was always clear when evidence was being heard at committee. We also need to be clear that even if the bill did seek to widen criteria to qualify for employment injury assistance, that would not be possible until after we've had the full and safe transfer up to 150,000 paper files for the DWP digitised and over to Social Security Scotland. Much has been made of timing of the introduction of a new Scottish benefit, of the new Scottish benefit. On that front, I do in part actually agree with Mr Griffin. We need certainty over case transfers. We need certainty over when we will have a full standalone Scottish benefit and when it will be operational and what that looks like, which is why I was pleased to hear that the consultation on that is imminent, and I think the Cabinet Secretary would say more, but didn't want to disrespect the process contained within this bill here this afternoon. But there also appears to have been a chicken and egg quandary around the whole conversation this afternoon. Do we set up a new employment injury assistance and then decide upon the nature of any advisory council? Do we set up an advisory council and introduce a new benefit? Yes, of course.
Mark Griffin.
A number of speakers have opposed the introduction of this bill on the basis that it comes before introduction of the benefit. I wonder if Mr Doris would reflect on the fact that we were both on the Social Security Committee in the last session, which introduced the Scottish Commission on Social Security to do this exact job, even though no benefits had been introduced by the Scottish Government at this point. So there is no chicken and egg situation here. There is a precedent that everyone in the last session of Parliament supported.
Bob Doris.
I thank the member in charge for that intervention. I think it's a wee bit different because SCOS now exists and the government has actually to decide whether to use SCOS or a new advisory council. So it is a bit different. We'll just have to disagree on that one. But I get the point that Mr Griffin is actually trying to make. So the Scottish Government doesn't see it as a chicken and egg scenario. They want to deliver both in tandem. And I agree. I'm pleased the consultation, as I've said, will commence shortly. And in doing so, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Government should clearly liaise very closely with Mr Griffin, although he may be just disappointed in relation to this afternoon. They should also give consideration of the membership for the statutory advisory council that Mr Griffin is seeking to set up to inform the advisory group that is going to advise on the formation of the new benefit. But I'm also very clear that a statutory advisory council, when there is a new benefit, may need a different skills mix for an advisory group to actually set up the benefit in the first place. Can I just finally, in concluding, say that whilst I will not be supporting the general principles today, legislation will be coming forward very shortly, I hope, from the Scottish Government, and that process will actually be much, much stronger because of the excellent efforts of Mr Griffin and his colleagues to bring us to this point this afternoon.
Thank you. We move to winding up speeches, and I call on Claire Baker. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I declare an interest as a member of Unite the Union. I am pleased to close this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour and to recognise the work of my colleague Mark Griffin in progressing this bill to this stage. I recognise the coalition of trade unions who are supporting the bill, as well as organisations such as Asbestos Action, Scottish Hazards and the Fair Work Convention. The Labour Party has a long and proud history of fighting to improve the rights of workers, and this bill is part of our ongoing work to make Scotland and the UK a better and safer place to work. The proposed role for trade unions in the Advisory Council would be to make sure that the voices of workers are at the core of a fairer social security system, and I am urging members to support this today. The current scheme of industrial injuries disablement benefits is outdated in the types of employment it covers. It is rooted in the male-dominated heavy industries of the 1960s and 1970s and is not reflective of modern workplaces. It fails to serve a raft of workers and the related risks of their employment, including shift workers, care workers and firefighters. And there is a clear gender dimension to these proposals, which I welcome. This has also been raised by Richard Leonard and Maggie Chapman when they talked about the evidence given by Close the Gap to the committee. Women's health and safety at work has been ignored for too long. Just 7% of claims for industrial injuries benefits are made to women. It was designed for male-dominated workplaces, and it systematically ignores and listens to women's injuries and made ill at work. We also have the proposal from Mark Griffin for the Advisory Council to be gender balanced, and I welcome that. While the Scottish Government will introduce employment injury assistance, it will not be able to seek advice from the UK Industry Advisory Council. The gap left here provides an opportunity to, instead of replicating an outdated and failing system, to set up a council that will help design and deliver the new employment industry benefit. It would advise the Scottish Government on the occupations and conditions it should cover and ensure that the voice of workers are at its core. The Council should not be part of a jigsaw, but core to advising the Government on designing and putting together the new benefit. It would draw on those with lived experience of employment injuries and illnesses, alongside medical expertise, workers, employees and representatives. It would give workers a voice in the process, and that is what is forward-thinking, inclusive and in line with Fair Work principles. As members will be aware, Workers' Memorial Day will take place at the end of April. It's always an important reminder to us of the need to do more to protect workers and to ensure that the families of those who have lost loved ones at work are able to secure justice. It does also recognise the impact of life-limiting industrial diseases. In the year to March 2023, 26 people in Scotland died in workplace accidents. 26 people who went to their place of work and never came home again, each one of them leaving behind a family in distress. In the last parliamentary session, members may know that I sought support for a bill to change the law allowing workplace deaths by introducing accountability for companies responsible. That bill was debated at stage 1 in January, but fell at that hurdle. In the 3 years since that debate, life continued to be lost in workplace accidents. And while I could not convince the Parliament of the competence of my bill, I do believe we should be doing more to understand the causes of fatalities and injuries at work, and this is where Mark Griffin's bill does have relevance. We know from HSE statistics that the rate of fatal injuries in Scotland are consistently higher than those for Great Britain. One possible explanation is that a greater proportion of workers in Scotland are employed in higher risk industry sectors or higher risk occupations. But if the figures are adjusted to take account for this rate, for Scotland it remains significantly higher. An Advisory Council on Social Security support could provide valuable information on workplace risk and safety and help us to understand why we have a poor record in these areas. I appreciate that HSE operates under governance of the UK Government and has responsibility for workplace safety. But that doesn't prohibit the Scottish Government from working with risk sectors or from responding to the concerns of bereaved families or families who are living with long-term health conditions. The inability to progress my culpable homicide bill was a disappointment, but the absence of any progress in addressing the issues at its core, which are shared with this bill we are discussing today, are a far greater frustration. The Scottish Government's response to Mark Griffin's bill today is similarly frustrating, not just with its failure to support a bill that seeks to support key workers and to improve an outdated injury benefit system, but also in its failure to progress any alternative route in a timely manner. The Scottish Government has had the power to deliver this employment injuries legislation since 2016, but we have made little progress. It's saying it is opposing this bill that it intends to take a wider-ranging consultation replacing the UK-wide scheme. But only after that will it decide what a Scottish body would look like. Yet, despite 3 years of promises, the consultation is yet to materialise. And I know that the Cabinet Secretary has said it is imminent, but we have waited a while and we do need to see faster progress. And I think part of the question put today is an advisory council the right approach? And I think it is. I think there are particular challenges in Scotland, and while this bill introduces a council which would be similar to the UK one, this bill does set out crucial differences that would modernise and reform the benefit. So is the debate today and the reluctance from the Government to support this really a question about processing and timing? And while the planned establishment of a stakeholder advisory group may be a step in the right direction, and the Cabinet Secretary may be able to say more of that in closing, without it being set up in statute, it wouldn't be independent and it could easily be disbanded before any recommendations were advanced. The Government does have to provide direction on how the new benefit in Scotland will be shaped. And while the Cabinet Secretary is clear that the Government is not supporting this Advisory Council or the bill today, how will her proposals address the real issues of the inequality and the outdated nature of the benefits so that it is able to meet the needs of women and respond to the impacts of the modern workplace on workers' health, including the cases of firefighters, teachers and footballers that we've heard about today? Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Miles Briggs. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I know he'll probably be feeling nauseous by now, but can I also start by paying tribute to Mark Griffin and his office for the power of work that he's put into this bill, and thank those who have also inputted to the deliberations and work of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee on his proposal. And I think there is consensus, and we've heard that today, over the urgent need for progress to be made on what this benefit will look like in Scotland and the advice which will be developed around that. I have and continue to have a lot of sympathy for his proposal. In the last session of Parliament, I worked with Government on Frank's Law to actually extend free personal care for people under 65. There was a lot of cross-party work in Parliament to reform our welfare system, to remove time limits, for example, for payments for terminal illness. And just recently, I've also launched a consultation on delivering a right to palliative care. So across this Parliament, I hope we can make progress on many of these issues. And I think it's really important that the debate we've had today and the work of Mark Griffin has helped to achieve pressure on the Scottish Government that we will now finally have a consultation, and that actually a version of what he is proposing seems to be what the Scottish Government will bring forward to help shape an employment injury-assisted benefit in Scotland. And we know that these will be some of the most complex cases, not only in terms of case transfer around the numbers, but also how this will be embedded in Social Security Scotland. And I think that's something we need to very much focus on as well. We also, though, cannot ignore the committee's report, and in reading the committee's report conclusions from their examination cross-party of the proposed bill, it's clear the committee continue to have significant concerns which have not been resolved during the time they've been able to look at the bill. The committee noted that before it could recommend establishing a new statutory body with its associated costs, the committee would need to be certain that this would be able to deliver on its aims. And the fact that we do not actually have a benefit in place now clearly does, as others have said, put the cart before the horse in being able to deliver a benefit and actually deliver the advice. Because I think it's really important, and many members have touched upon this, in terms of what is an older, industrial-aged injury benefit, but what will be a complex future, especially post-COVID, at looking at those who will be eligible. For example, complex cases around work-related acquired long COVID for NHS professionals, care home professionals and our teaching professionals. That is something which work is just currently starting on, and whether or not this will be accepted and people will be able to access this benefit in the future is something all of us will have to make sure is properly scrutinised, and I hope the work of what the Government is now suggesting will take place. As the Royal College of Nursing Scotland state in their helpful briefing, with less than 2 years until the agency agreement with the Department for Work and Pensions is due to end, the Scottish Government need to publish its consultation, setting out its proposals for the new EIA. And we have heard that today, but I hope the Cabinet Secretary will understand cross-party. There's a lot of interest in this, and we need to see progress made urgently to include also the plans of what expert advisory group will support the establishment of the new Scottish benefit, and what health groups will be involved as well. When I had my intervention earlier, I was wondering what medical groups will be included on that as well. So I hope as soon as Government can provide that, they will, and that those of us who are interested and want to make sure we can also input into this will be included. And it's also important we look towards the organisations who are calling for this and calling for action. I've met with the organisations which many have highlighted, from Injury Time to Action on Asbestosis, a range of organisations who have highlighted cancer-related higher rates of cancer in many workforces, including our firefighters and Scotland's industrial communities as well. So it is important that they are also at the table on this, and I completely accept the work which Mark Griffin has done with unions to make sure that their voices are heard on this. I think that's incredibly important as well. As many members have said across the Chamber, it does feel like this has come too early, but it has also made the Government act, and that is something I think Mark Griffin should be pleased with, that he has actually made sure that the government has listened. To conclude, it's clear from this debate that we need to see urgent action. I hope the Cabinet Secretary will look to update Parliament at the earliest opportunity. Given the deliberations of the committee, Scottish Conservatives will not be supporting this at stage one, but we certainly want to see the principles of delivering what Scotland needs to see around the advice to establish this benefit move forward at an urgent pace, and certainly will work across Parliament to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and can I thank all the members who have contributed to the debate, and once again start by thanking Mark Griffin for introducing this bill. We don't agree on the specifics, Presiding Officer, but it has undoubtedly shone a light on the issues that are inherent to the UK Government's industrial injury scheme, and it's also helped strengthen the voices of the stakeholders and those with experience of the current scheme. That is vitally important context as the Scottish Government undertakes the work on the employment injury assistance, and I do look forward to my continued work with the stakeholders and the member. But in saying all that, Presiding Officer, this bill, if passed, would tie our hands at an early stage of policy development by wedding us to replicating a fundamental part of the UK scheme. The committee's heard extensive criticisms of the UK Council and how it operates, including its lack of research capacity and length of time it took for recommendations to be implemented. So I want to be clear that simply replicating that system in Scotland with the same criteria within the same framework of benefit would not improve the outcomes for the people who rely on the scheme or for those who are currently excluded. It will not change eligibility. It will not bring anyone who currently isn't eligible any closer to receiving a payment. And the point that Colette Stevenson made earlier, I think, is very, very important, that this bill, I think, does falsely raise expectations. Now, I have been clear that I don't oppose what is behind the idea of a Scottish Advisory Council. However, defining its membership and functions in primary legislation before we've decided how to proceed with employment injury assistance does not make sense. We can't decide the kind of scrutiny, advice and oversight of a benefit that sits in an early stage of development. Now, this bill is about developing an advisory council for a benefit that does not exist yet. It can be used for developing the design of a benefit, but as I've said earlier on, we don't need that to be done in statutory footing. We can do that and have done that in the past for all other benefits without such a requirement. But I am looking forward to launching our consultation outlining our immediate intentions for the delivery of employment injury assistance in the coming weeks. As I said to Jeremy Balfour, I did choose to wait until this debate because if Parliament had chose to move forward with this bill to stages 2 and 3, that would have had a material impact on what is in the consultation. If Parliament decides to vote against the general principles of the bill today, then the consultation will arrive in short order. Now, many members have asked about the new advisory group that I have already mentioned, and can I be clear on what we are intending to do on that? There will be invitations for a range of people with lived experience, but particularly also including trade union representatives to ensure that the voice of workers are very much at the core of the design. Also disabled people's organisations, welfare advisory groups and experts in occupational health. Members have also suggested, including Miles Briggs, some other avenues that we may wish to explore around membership, and I'm more than happy in correspondence or indeed through meeting members to discuss people's thoughts on who would be on that group. And that group can, again, be undertaken in short order once we have the consultation underway and then completed. Can I also reassure members that the Clydebank Asbestos Group will, I hope, be part of that. It would certainly be my intention to extend an invitation to them to join that, and to Maggie Chapman and indeed others who mentioned firefighters. I would absolutely commit to encouraging the voice of firefighters to be heard through the consultation and indeed the next steps. That is such an important part of the work that we do need to move on. The aspects around what will be included in the benefit is something that we will, of course, return to. But I think it is important to clarify that even if this advisory council was set up, it would not help prevent workplace disease, because employment law and health and safety executive are reserved to the UK Government. So many people are wishing this bill to achieve things which, quite frankly, Presiding Officer, they may wish to happen, but will not, cannot happen within the current setup and the powers that we have. But we are continuing, of course, to work on our consultation, and again I give my reassurance we will do so in short order. Presiding Officer, each of us in this chamber shares the ambition of improving the lives of disabled people in Scotland, and that, of course, does include the people currently in receipt of industrial injuries scheme benefits and, of course, those who will hopefully be able to apply for its replacement. I again thank the member for the work on this bill. We do not agree with the general principles of it, but I would reiterate my offer to work with him in the coming months as we work to deliver a better system for the people of Scotland.
Thank you. And I call on Mark Griffin to wind up. If you could take us to 5 o'clock, Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank members from across the chamber for their contributions to the debate this afternoon. I began my opening remarks by asking members not to turn their backs on the nurses, social care workers, teachers, shop workers, footballers and firefighters who are ill simply because of the job they do. Members should know our time is limited here. We have less than a year to get this right, and ask again, if not now, then when? And I'd like to address some of the issues that colleagues have raised. In particular, I wanted to thank colleagues on the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for their consideration of the bill, their extensive evidence gathering and those who responded to the calls for views. I welcome its acknowledgement that the current system fails to deliver for women and ethnic minority workers or to take account of modern occupations and diseases. On the one hand, the committee concludes, and I quote, that the case has been made for giving effective voice to workers, trade unions, employers and lived experience, including the lived experience of disabled people in the design and delivery of this new benefit, although the final conclusion of the committee's report seems to be at odds with that. Now, we have heard a range of objections as to why members can't support the bill as it stands. The primary one seems to be around timing. The argument that we can't somehow introduce an advisory council in advance of a benefit being introduced. But for members who were here in this last Parliament will know that through the course of the Social Security Scotland Act, we introduced the Scottish Commission on Social Security to do this very job, to advise, to scrutinise regulations, to make recommendations to Government and Parliament on the benefits, the new benefits that the Government were introducing. Parliament had no problem with setting up that commission in advance of any benefits being introduced. And we've heard specifically from the interim chair of the Scottish Commission on Social Security that they do not have the expertise in workplace illness and injury to do that job for the new benefit that will be introduced. So there is a gaping hole here in the legislative landscape, in the scrutiny landscape and advice landscape that this council would fill. It's not putting the cart before the horse. It is putting people with lived experience, workers and their representatives who know best about the illnesses and injuries that are happening right now in modern workplaces, getting them round the table on a statutory footing, not one that can be dismissed easily by Government, to make recommendations on what the new benefit should look like. That's not something that is out of place in this Parliament. Like I said, it's something that we explicitly committed to unanimously in the last session of Parliament when we debated and passed the Scottish Social Security Act. Now, on the consultation, I'm glad to hear that the Government is now providing a more definitive timetable for that consultation. I look forward to seeing it. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has said that the reason it hasn't happened so far was because of Scottish Child Payment and COVID. But I've got a timeline here of the amount of times that we have been promised a consultation We were promised a consultation in June 2019. That was after the Scottish Child Payment was first proposed in March 2018. There was an announcement to accelerate Scottish Child Payment timetable in September 2019. But then in April 2020, the Government still committed to a full consultation on EIA, seemingly with no issue with the impact of the work programme for Scottish Child Payment. And again, for the last 2 years, we've had repeated promises of a consultation on what a full package of proposals for what an employment injuries assistance system would look like. So I'm glad that we're finally getting to that point, that it's taken a member's bill to get us to that point, but the Government have promised this almost every year for the past 5 years. Now, similarly, on the announcement of an advisory group, I welcome that. It's a tiny step in the right direction, but my Labour colleagues have pointed out, Paul Kane, Richard Leonard, Claire Baker have pointed out that advisory groups have come and gone. It's absolutely ironic that the Disability and Carers Benefit Advisory Group, they were set up by Government. They actually recommended that an Employment Injuries Advisory Council was set up, but they were disbanded before that recommendation ever saw the light of day. So I'm not filled with hope that an advisory group that can be disbanded at the whims of Government if it doesn't like its recommendations is going to fulfil the role of a statutory advisory council, and I will.
Cabinet Secretary.
I appreciate where Mark Griffin's coming from, but I will push back on this aspect, because that's a serious accusation to say that we disbanded DACPEB because we didn't agree with its recommendations. It fulfilled its purpose in that it advised on disability and carers' benefits. It did so, and therefore its work was concluded and it moved on, and we thanked it very much for it. I think that assertion is very damaging and, quite frankly, an insult to everyone that was on DACPEAG for all those years.
Mark Griffin.
I think if the Cabinet Secretary reflects and looks back at the record, at no point did I say that that particular advisory group was disbanded because the Government didn't agree with its recommendations. I simply made the point that advisory groups can be disbanded if Government don't agree with their recommendations. And I make the point again that that advisory group did recommend that an advisory council was created and were disbanded before that recommendation was made good. That is a statement of fact, not my opinion, not an assertion and not a reflection on the work of that group. They clearly agreed with me, so I think the record will reflect that. Now, the Scottish Government's agency agreement with the Department of Work and Pensions, I said this in my opening remarks, state that we must have a business case in place for how it will deliver the new benefit by March 2025. Less than a year away, a government needs to have a full business case on how it will deliver employment injuries assistance. That seems to me clear that this is the right time to be talking about the introduction of an advisory council to support the work of government that it clearly needs, since it's taken 5 years even to get to the point of introducing a consultation on employment injuries assistance. And it would make sense, rather than to reinvent the wheel at a later date, to accept the proposals contained within this recommendation. But Presiding Officer, let me outline why I thought that this bill was important in the first place, since I do have until 5 o'clock. I started thinking about this bill when we were right back in the grips of a pandemic, and I was thinking about key workers who caught COVID through that pandemic, key workers who had to go to work while we had the safety of staying safe at home, some of those who caught COVID through the course of their employment, who developed long COVID and are still off their work. Some are still off work, some have been dismissed, some people still can't go back to the job that they love. We were on the doorsteps, banging pots and pans, applauding those workers, but now we can't give them a place at the table, advising on the benefit system that would give them the recognition for the conditions, the illnesses and injuries that they're still suffering because they bravely went out to work while we stayed safe at home. But the more I looked at the shortcomings of the current employment injury benefit system, it became much more apparent that it went beyond just recognition of those with long COVID, you're more than 10 times more likely to be able to claim this benefit, the existing benefit, if you're a man, despite women being far more likely to be found working in caregiving roles that can lead to musculoskeletal injuries. It's an entitlement that absolutely fails half of the population. And the only way that I can see to make it fairer is to have a modern representative advisory council, gender balanced, that will take account of the workplace as it is right now, rather than it was in the last century. I have a real fear, Presiding Officer, that we are devolving an industrial injuries disablement benefit system that reflects the workplaces of the last century, male-dominated workplaces of the last century, and that those workers and those representatives who fought hard for recognition of the illnesses and injuries that affected them, as those predominantly men sadly die as we go forward, that entitlement to this benefit, if unreformed, will die with it. That we'll see this entitlement removed from the social security landscape unless we update the entitlement and eligibility criteria right now. And that goes to the heart of why I laid this bill, because to do that we must have the voices of lived experience of workers, of their representatives, round the table, designing the system, making recommendations to government on eligibility, on prescription and a whole range of other issues. This is the opportunity to put voices of lived experience of workers at the centre of design and delivery of the benefit. They should be entitled to it, and I won't give up until those voices are heard and acted on.
I call Marie McNair for a point of order.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I failed to admit that I mentioned that I am a member of the trade union Unison just before I spoke earlier on in the debate, and I'd be grateful if the official record could be amended to reflect that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McNair. Your comments will have been recorded. That concludes the debate on Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council Bill at Stage 1, and it's time to move on to the next item of business. And there's one question to be put as a result of today's business. And that question is that motion 12882 in the name of Mark Griffin on Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council Bill at Stage 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system. The question is that motion 12882 in the name of Mark Griffin on the Scottish Employment Injuries Advisory Council Bill at Stage 1 be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Marie McNair for a point of order.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I couldn't connect. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Ms McNair. We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on motion 12882 in the name of Mark Griffin is yes 20, no 95. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore not agreed, and that concludes decision time, and I close this meeting.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.